She stepped off the train with a single suitcase, a heart full of hope, and walked straight into the cruelest trap a man could set for a trusting woman. No groom, no love, no future as the letters had promised, just a strange town, the darkness descending, and the bitter truth that she had been deceived from the start. But this isn't the story of a broken woman. This is the story of a woman who decided not to give up. Like and comment with the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has come. The train had been moving for so long that Vivian Hale had started to measure time in a different way. Not by hours or miles, but by the slow, steady disappearance of everything familiar. Ohio had gone first, then Indiana, then the flat green plains of Illinois. By the time the locomotive crossed into the rougher country further west, even the sky looked different, wider, less forgiving, the kind of sky that didn't care whether you made it or not. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her traveling bag wedged between her feet, watching the landscape change outside the window. The other passengers in the car had thinned out considerably in the last 2 days. At the stop before Redstone Crossing, a family of 4 had disembarked with so much luggage it had taken 3 men and 20 minutes to unload it all. After that, the car was nearly empty. Just Vivian, an elderly man who slept with his hat over his face, and a woman in a gray dress who hadn't spoken a word since St. Louis and seemed determined to keep that record intact. Vivian didn't mind the quiet. She had been rehearsing things in her head for weeks. What she would say when she first saw him. She had decided against anything overly formal. A simple hello, maybe, and then let him take the lead. He'd written that he was a man who preferred plain talk over ceremony, and she had taken him at his word. What she would think of Redstone Crossing. She'd looked it up in a geography pamphlet she'd found at the Cincinnati Library. It was described as a prosperous frontier settlement with significant cattle operations and a growing population of industrious families. That was the kind of language geography pamphlets used when they wanted to sound encouraging about places that were probably very rough. What it would feel like to begin a new life. She had been less certain about this one. Her old life in Columbus, the one she was leaving behind, hadn't been terrible. She had worked as a bookkeeper's assistant for 6 years, lived in a rented room above a bakery, and spent most of her evenings reading or writing letters. Her father had died when she was 19. Her mother had followed 3 years later. She had no siblings. She was 27 years old and had come to understand, slowly and without much drama, that the life she had in Columbus was the entire life she was going to have if she didn't do something about it, which was how she had ended up in a correspondence with a man named Douglas Merritt, rancher, Redstone Crossing, territory of Wyoming. The letters had started through a placement agency in Cincinnati, a respectable firm that matched working women with frontier men who were looking for wives. Vivian had been skeptical at first. The whole business felt vaguely embarrassing, like admitting she couldn't manage her own future. But her friend Clara had talked her into it with characteristic bluntness. "You're 26, Viv. The men in Columbus aren't going to suddenly start noticing you just because you wait another year. At least this way, you have some say in who you end up with." Clara wasn't wrong. She rarely was, which was one of her more irritating qualities. The agency had sent Vivian a list of 12 men who had submitted inquiries. She had written back to 3 of them with careful, measured letters that told enough about herself to be honest without being reckless. 2 of the men had replied with letters that were polite but perfunctory. The kind of letters a man wrote when he had also written to 11 other women and was keeping his options open. Douglas Merritt's letter had been different. It was long. It was specific. It talked about the particular way the light hit the mountains in the late afternoon and how the silence out there was different from any silence she'd ever known. Not empty, he wrote, but full, like something was listening. He talked about his cattle operation, his property, the house he had built with his own hands over 3 summers. He talked about what he was looking for. Not a woman who could cook and keep quiet, but a partner, someone with a head on her shoulders, someone who understood that frontier life was hard and wanted it anyway. She had written back. He had written again, and then again and again and again. 2 letters a week for nearly a year, until the stack of his correspondence was thick enough to use as a doorstop. She had fallen in love with the letters before she had any real certainty she'd fallen in love with the man. She understood this distinction. She had thought about it carefully, but the letters were so consistent, so specific, so layered with small details that could not possibly have been invented. What would be the point of inventing the detail about the old dog that slept by the fire and chased rabbits in his sleep? that she had gradually set aside her skepticism and let herself believe. She was still believing right up until the moment the train pulled into Redstone Crossing and she stepped onto the platform with her bag in her hand and her heart beating too fast, and there was nobody waiting. She stood there for what felt like a long time. The platform wasn't large. It was a rough planked affair jutting off the side of a squat depot building, and it was crowded with the ordinary confusion of arrival: men loading freight, a wagon driver arguing with the station master over a bill of lading, 2 children chasing a dog. She watched each face carefully. None of them were looking for her. She waited until the platform had mostly cleared. Then she went into the depot and asked the man behind the counter if there had been any messages left for a Miss Vivian Hale. He checked. There hadn't. "Do you know a rancher by the name of Douglas Merritt?" she asked. "He has property somewhere near here, I believe." The man frowned. He was heavy-set, with the kind of permanent squint that came from years of reading small print in bad light. "Merritt," he repeated, turning the name over like he was checking it for cracks. "Can't say I do. And I know most of the ranchers in this district." "Perhaps he's newer," Vivian said. "He's been operating here for several years, but maybe you wouldn't have occasion to—" "Ma'am," he said it not unkindly, but with the patience of a man who had learned to deliver bad news in small, even doses. "I've been at this counter for 11 years. I know every outfit within 50 miles of this station. There's no Douglas Merritt out there." The floor felt slightly wrong under her feet. Not tilting exactly, just not as solid as it had been a moment ago. "I see," she said. "Thank you." She walked back out onto the platform and sat down on her bag because her legs had decided they were done with standing. The train was gone. The afternoon sun was dropping toward the western ridgeline, and the shadow it threw across the platform was long and cold. "Think," she told herself. "Don't fall apart. Think." She thought through what she knew. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles on the basis of letters from a man who apparently did not exist. She had given the placement agency $50, her savings from 18 months of careful economy, as their fee for the match. She had packed everything she owned into one bag, resigned her position at the bookkeeper's office, given up her room above the bakery, and come here. Here was a frontier town she'd never seen before, surrounded by country she didn't know. With the sum total of $4.60 in her purse, she pressed her hands flat against her knees to keep them from shaking. A man came out of the depot and walked past her without looking up. A woman with a basket of eggs crossed the far end of the platform. A horse tied to the hitching post outside the general store across the street stamped its foot with lazy irritation. Nobody was coming. By the time the sun was fully gone, Vivian had established 3 things. First, there was a hotel on the main street, a block from the depot, that rented rooms for 50 cents a night. At that rate, she had approximately 9 nights before she ran out of money entirely. Second, the woman at the hotel desk, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Pell, had confirmed what the station master said. There was no Douglas Merritt ranching anywhere near Redstone Crossing. There was no ranch matching the description in the letters. The placement agency in Cincinnati, when Mrs. Pell grudgingly helped her think through the options, was almost certainly fraudulent, a well-known enough scheme in frontier territories where lonely men and desperate women made easy marks from 1,000 miles apart. Third, she could not go back. The train ticket alone would be more than she had, and there was nothing in Columbus waiting for her anyway. Her room was taken, her job was taken, and the life she'd left behind had already closed over itself like water over a stone. She sat on the edge of the narrow hotel bed and looked at the $4.60 arranged on the quilt in front of her. Then she picked it up, put it back in her purse, and went to find something to eat, because she hadn't eaten since morning, and despair was a luxury she couldn't afford until she'd at least had supper. The only place that seemed to be serving food at that hour was a saloon at the end of the main street that had a sign in the window advertising hot meals. Vivian was aware, as she pushed the door open, that a respectable woman walking into a saloon alone in the frontier West was making a statement she hadn't entirely intended to make. She was also aware that she was hungry, that this was the only option she'd found, and that her capacity for caring about appearances had taken a significant blow in the last 6 hours. The room was loud and smelled of tobacco and unwashed bodies and the particular sharp bite of cheap whiskey. Men at the bar turned to look at her. Men at the tables turned to look at her. The whole room seemed to recalibrate slightly, the way a room does when something unexpected walks into it. She walked to the bar, found an empty stool at the far end away from the worst of the crowd, and asked the barman if she could get a meal. He looked at her for a moment, assessing. Then he said, 2 bits. Beans and salt pork and cornbread. That's fine, she said. She ate without looking up, which was harder than it sounds. She could feel the room watching her. Men at the nearest table had lowered their voices, which was somehow worse than if they'd left them at full volume. The murmuring carried an edge of speculation that made the back of her neck prickle. You got a husband coming to meet you? She looked up. The man who had spoken was sitting 2 stools down from her, young, fair-haired, with the kind of smile that had probably worked on a lot of people before he learned to weaponize it. His friend, sitting beside him, was watching her with similar interest. I'm just eating, Vivian said. Didn't ask what you were doing. Asked if your husband was coming. I heard what you asked. The young man's smile widened. He slid off his stool and moved 1 seat closer. He smelled of whiskey, and he held himself with the easy confidence of a man who was used to not being refused. Settle down, Hicks. The voice came from the other end of the bar. Low, even. Not loud, but somehow carrying anyway. Vivian looked toward it. The man who had spoken was sitting alone at the far corner of the bar with a coffee cup in front of him. Not a glass. A cup. Which was notable. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered but not ostentatiously so, with dark hair gone early to gray at the temples and a face that had seen enough weather to have character. He wasn't looking at the fair-haired man. He was looking at his coffee. Mind your own business, Mercer, the fair-haired man said, but with somewhat less confidence than before. Last I checked, Walt runs a saloon, not a parlor house, the man at the end of the bar said, still not looking up. Lady's eating her supper. There was a pause. The fair-haired man, Hicks, looked at Vivian, then at Mercer, then back at his whiskey. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a dismissal and moved back to his original stool. Vivian let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked down the bar. The man called Mercer was still looking at his coffee. He didn't look her way. She finished her meal and asked the barman for a glass of water, and while she drank it, she thought with the careful analytical clarity that kicked in when emotion got too large to process about what she was going to do. She could stay in Redstone Crossing and find work, but the town didn't look large enough to support much by way of employment for a woman with her skills. She could try to contact the agency in Cincinnati, but she had no realistic expectation that the $50 was recoverable or that anything useful would come of it. She could write to Clara, but Clara had 3 children and a husband who worked the railroads and no money to spare and no room in her house. Or she could... What? She turned the problem over. She was good at numbers. She was good at organization. She could teach. She had done some informal tutoring back in Columbus. She could manage accounts. She was, in the blunt assessment she had developed of herself over 27 years, competent and clear-headed and willing to work. The question was whether any of that was worth anything out here. You need something. She looked up. The man from the end of the bar had moved without her noticing and was now 2 seats away, coffee cup still in hand. It wasn't a question, the way he'd said it. I'm fine, she said, automatic. He raised an eyebrow, just slightly. He had the kind of face that was difficult to read quickly. Not closed exactly, but deliberate, like he had learned not to show his thinking until he'd finished doing it. Hicks'll come back, he said, or someone like him will. Town like this, woman alone at a saloon bar at 9 o'clock. That's not fine. It's an invitation to trouble whether you mean it to be or not. I didn't have a great deal of choice in the matter, Vivian said. The other establishments weren't serving food. Where are you staying? She hesitated, then decided there was no reason to pretend. The hotel, up the block. And you're alone, obviously. He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hand slowly, a habit that seemed to be more about thinking than restlessness. You come in on the afternoon train? Yes? Who were you meeting? She met his eyes. They were dark gray, steady, giving nothing away. A man named Douglas Merritt, she said, who it turns out doesn't exist. I've traveled from Columbus, Ohio, and I've been very thoroughly swindled, and I have approximately $4.50 to my name. Now you know as much as anyone. She didn't know why she told him all of it. She hadn't intended to. But there was something in his directness that had extracted it from her. The absence of sympathy, maybe. He wasn't looking at her with pity, which meant she didn't have to defend herself against it. He absorbed this information with the same unhurried expression. How old are you? That's an intrusive question. I'm asking because you look young enough that there might still be family somewhere. 27, she said, and there's no family. He nodded slowly. I'm Cole Mercer. I run a ranch about 12 miles north of here. He paused. My sister runs a boarding house in Pine Hollow, which is about 30 miles east. It's a decent place. She takes in working women, mostly. Teachers, occasionally women in your situation. She doesn't charge more than folks can pay. Vivian looked at him steadily. Why are you telling me this? Because otherwise you're going to spend your $4.50 on a hotel room and be in a worse position in a week. He said it without inflection, just fact. My sister's name is Ruth Aldridge. The boarding house is called the Aldridge House. Not very creative, but it's easy to remember. The stage to Pine Hollow runs Tuesday and Friday mornings from the depot. And what does this cost me? He picked up his coffee. Nothing. She'll work something out with you when you get there. Ruth's practical. Vivian studied him. He wasn't leaning forward. He wasn't performing generosity for an audience. He had turned slightly back toward the bar, as though the conversation might be over and he was fine either way. I don't know you, she said. No, he agreed. You don't? For all I know, you're running another version of the same scheme I just fell for. He considered this with what seemed like genuine thought. That's fair, he said. You don't have any reason to trust me. He set some coins on the bar. I'm going to finish this coffee and head back to my ranch. If you want to write to Ruth first, I can give you her address, and you can decide later. Stage doesn't run again until Friday. He reached into his coat and produced a small notebook, tore out a page, and wrote an address in the kind of careful, deliberate handwriting that suggested a man who hadn't had much formal education but had worked at making it legible. He set the paper on the bar between them and didn't push it toward her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay on the narrow hotel bed and stared at the ceiling and turned everything over methodically, the way she always did when she was frightened, inventory the facts, identify what could be controlled, set aside what couldn't. Facts. She was in Redstone Crossing, Wyoming territory, with almost no money, no job, and no connections. The man who had promised her a future had been a fiction. The agency that had supposedly vetted him had either been negligent or complicit. She had 9 days before her money ran out. What she could control. Whether to take the stage to Pine Hollow. Whether to write to Ruth Aldridge first. Whether to stay in Redstone Crossing and try to find work. What she couldn't control. Whether Cole Mercer was who he appeared to be. Whether the boarding house was real. Whether any of it would work out. She stared at the address on the torn notebook page, which she'd set on the small table by the bed. The handwriting was plain and even. Ruth Aldridge, Aldridge House, Pine Hollow, Wyoming territory. She thought about the way he had spoken, not to her specifically, at first, but at the situation. Settle down, Hicks? Like he was correcting something minor, not performing heroism. Like it would have been more trouble not to say it than to say it. She thought about the way he hadn't pushed the paper toward her. She had spent a year falling for a man who turned out to be a phantom, built out of beautiful language and manufactured detail. She was aware, acutely, that her judgment had already failed her once in spectacular fashion. But there was a difference, she thought, between the elaborate warmth of Douglas Merritt's letters and the careful plainness of Cole Mercer sitting at a saloon bar telling her, without apparent interest in impressing her, that there was a boarding house 30 miles east run by his practical sister. One of those things smelled like bait. The other smelled like a man who had something better to do and had decided to spend 10 minutes being useful anyway. She still didn't know if she could trust it. But at 4 a.m, with the sound of the wind moving through the gaps in the building and the distant punctuation of someone's drunk argument drifting up from the street, she decided that Pine Hollow was a better gamble than 9 days in this hotel, counting down to nothing. She spent the next 3 days the only way she knew how to spend time she was waiting out, doing something useful. The hotel owner, a taciturn man named Garrett, mentioned on the second morning that he had been unable to reconcile his accounts for the past 2 months, and that this was causing him considerable irritation. Vivian asked, in what she hoped was a casual tone, whether he would like help with it. He looked at her skeptically. "You any good at figures? I worked as a bookkeeper's assistant for 6 years in Columbus." "Columbus, Ohio?" "Yes." He made a sound of vague assessment. "I'll pay you $1 if you can sort it out." It took her 4 hours. The problem was elementary. A consistent transposition error in the ledger that had been compounding across entries for 8 weeks. She corrected it, notated the method clearly so it wouldn't happen again, and wrote a brief summary of what she'd found. Garrett looked it over. Then he looked at her. Then he paid her the $1 and said, "You want to stay another few nights? I'll take it off the room." "That's generous," she said. "It's practical," he said, with exactly the same intonation Cole Mercer had used. And she had the sudden strange thought that maybe this was just how people talked out here, without ornamentation, without selling anything. She wrote to Ruth Aldridge that afternoon. She kept the letter short and factual. Who she was, what had happened, that her brother had suggested she write. She didn't make any particular appeal. She just laid out the situation. Then she waited. On the third morning, the Friday before the stage ran, Ruth's reply arrived, which was faster than she'd expected, and which told her something about either the mail service between Redstone Crossing and Pine Hollow, or about Ruth Aldridge herself. The letter was 1 paragraph. "Miss Hale, my brother wrote to me Tuesday evening. I have a room available, and I can always use someone with a head for accounts. Stage gets in around noon on Fridays. I'll have my hired man meet it. Ruth Aldridge." Vivian read it twice. Then she went and told Garrett she'd be taking the stage in the morning, and settled up her account, and packed her bag, and sat by the window of her room looking out at the dark bulk of the mountains to the west while the sun went down. Cole Mercer had written to his sister on Tuesday evening, the same evening she'd spoken to him in the saloon. He hadn't mentioned doing that. He'd just given her the address and let her make up her own mind, and written the letter anyway. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she filed it away in the part of her mind where she put things she didn't have enough information to assess yet, and went to bed. Yet, the stage to Pine Hollow left at 7 in the morning from the front of the general store. There were 4 other passengers, a dry goods drummer with 2 sample cases, a middle-aged woman in a proper bonnet who turned out to be a school teacher returning from a visit to her sister, a young man who said nothing and slept most of the way, and an older rancher who talked for the first hour about the difficulty of getting decent hay in dry years before running out of steam and also going to sleep. Vivian sat by the window and watched the country go by. It was different from what she'd imagined, reading geography pamphlets in a Cincinnati library. The pamphlets had made it sound large in an abstract way, vast prairies, towering mountain ranges, fertile river valleys, but the reality of it was something else. It was large in a way that was almost aggressive. The sky came down so far on every side that you could see weather happening 40 miles away, dark curtains of rain dragging across distant ridgelines, while the road you were on was still in full sun. The grass was pale gold and moved in long waves. The mountains to the west were white-capped even in late spring. She had never seen anything like it. She had not expected to find it beautiful. She had been too busy being terrified to find much of anything beautiful in the last 4 days. But looking at the country through the stage window, the sheer size of it, indifferent and ancient and completely unimpressed by any of her problems, she felt something shift in her chest. Not comfort, exactly. More like perspective. Like the country was telling her, with total disinterest, that whatever had happened to her was very small against this much sky. She was still frightened, she was still angry, in the careful, compressed way she dealt with anger, but not letting it run because running anger was useless, but she could feel the edges of it, the hard, cold burn of it, when she thought about the letters, about the year she had spent believing, about how thoroughly she had wanted to believe. She was going to deal with that later. Right now there was the stage and the mountains and the arrangement of getting from one place to another and figuring out what came next. Pine Hollow turned out to be larger than Redstone Crossing. 2 streets instead of 1, a proper church, a schoolhouse, a mercantile that looked to be doing solid business. The stage pulled in at 10 minutes past noon to a small depot that was no more impressive than the one at Redstone Crossing, but had window boxes with early flowers in them, which for some reason Vivian found reassuring. A young man with a weathered hat was waiting by a wagon. He held a piece of cardboard with "Hail" written on it in large, careful letters. She walked toward him, and he nodded and said, "You Miss Hale?" "Yes." "Tom Briggs, work for Mrs. Aldridge." He took her bag before she could offer it and put it in the wagon. "She's got dinner waiting." It was, she thought, a practical sort of welcome, which she was beginning to understand was exactly what she should have expected. Ruth Aldridge was 43 years old and looked like a woman who had earned every one of those years doing something that required actual effort. She was tall and angular, with Cole's gray eyes and the kind of straight-backed posture that comes from years of being too busy to slump. She met Vivian at the door of the Aldridge house, a large two-story frame building set back from the main street behind a garden that was clearly being taken seriously, and shook her hand once, firmly. "You look like you've had a hard week," Ruth said. "I have," Vivian said. "Come in. Tell me about it over dinner, and then you can sleep." So Vivian sat at a long table in the kitchen. The proper dining room was for boarders, Ruth explained, but the kitchen was where real conversations happened, and ate beef stew and biscuits, and told the whole thing. Plainly, without ornamentation. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was a quality Vivian had come to appreciate deeply in the last week. When she was finished, Ruth said, "The agency is in Cincinnati?" "Yes. I don't know if they were knowingly part of it or just careless. Either way, they're worthless to you." Ruth refilled her coffee cup without asking. "I've seen this before. Not often, but enough. Man builds a story with enough real details to be convincing. Collects money from the agency, probably. Sometimes he comes in person later and takes more directly, but with women coming this far from home, often he just doesn't show and keeps whatever he already has." Vivian looked at the table. "I was careful," she said, more quietly than she intended. "I thought I was careful." "You were operating on information someone deliberately designed to fool you," Ruth said. "There's a difference between being fooled and being stupid. The first one just means someone worked hard enough at the lie." It was not a soft thing to say, but it was not said softly. It was said like arithmetic, like Ruth was laying out the logical structure so Vivian could see it clearly. "You mentioned you can manage accounts," Ruth said. "Yes. I have 2 sets of books that have gotten away from me, the house accounts and the accounts for the supply store I co-own with my neighbor. The woman who is managing them moved to Denver in February, and I haven't found a replacement." She looked at Vivian directly. "I can't pay you much. But room and board is covered, and I'll pay you $4 a week once I've seen your work. $4 a week, plus room and board." It was less than she'd made in Columbus, but Columbus was gone. "I'd like to see the books," Vivian said. Ruth nodded once. "Tomorrow morning. Tonight you sleep." She showed Vivian to a room on the 2nd floor, small but clean, with a window that looked out over the garden and the distant line of mountains. There was a quilt on the bed that someone had made with considerable skill, and a lamp on the table that gave off a steady light. Vivian sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her bag on the floor beside her, the same bag she'd carried out of Columbus 3 weeks ago with a completely different future in her head. She was not fine. She understood that. The anger was there, and underneath it was something more complicated. Grief, maybe, for the years she'd spent investing in something that had never been real. For the particular humiliation of having been so willing to believe. She would need to sit with all of that at some point and actually feel it instead of filing it away under things to deal with later. But later was not tonight. Tonight there was a room with a quilt and a lamp and dinner in her stomach, and a woman downstairs who had looked at her situation without pity and offered her a practical way forward. It wasn't what she had come west to find, but it was something real, and right now real was worth more than she could say. She reached over and turned down the lamp and lay back on the quilt without even undressing, and was asleep before she finished thinking. She woke before dawn to the sound of Ruth moving around downstairs, and for approximately 4 seconds she didn't know where she was. Then it came back. All of it, in the particular compressed rush that the first morning in a new place always brings. And she lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around her. There was a rooster somewhere outside. A door opened and closed below. The smell of coffee drifted up through the floorboards, faint but definite. She got up, washed her face in the basin on the dresser, put on her second-best dress because she had decided sometime during the night that first impressions mattered even when you were starting over, and went downstairs. Ruth was at the stove and did not look surprised to see her. "Coffee's there," she said, nodding at the pot. "Eggs in 10 minutes." There were two other women at the kitchen table. A young woman named Della, who worked at the mercantile and had the look of someone who was permanently slightly tired but managing, and an older woman named Mrs. Fenton, who taught at the Pine Hollow schoolhouse and who examined Vivian over her coffee cup with the precise, assessing look of a woman who had been evaluating strangers for 30 years and had gotten very good at it. "Cole wrote that you came out from Ohio to meet a man who wasn't real," Mrs. Fenton said, with the directness of someone who considered small talk an inefficiency. "That's correct," Vivian said. "Foolish business, those correspondence agencies." "I agree with you now," Vivian said. "I didn't a month ago." Mrs. Fenton made a small sound that might have been approval. "What did you do back in Ohio?" "Bookkeeping, some tutoring." "What subjects?" "Mathematics, primarily, some grammar." Mrs. Fenton set her cup down. "I have 23 children in that schoolhouse, 8 of whom are so far behind in arithmetic that they'll have trouble functioning as adults if someone doesn't catch them up. I have one of me and 23 of them, and I cannot do it all." She looked at Vivian steadily. "I can't pay you, at least not at first. But if you're going to be here anyway and you have mornings free, I could use the help." Vivian thought about her $4 a week in her small room upstairs and the fact that she had come 2,000 miles to build something and had arrived with nothing. "I have mornings free," she said. Ruth put eggs on the table and sat down without commenting on any of this, but something in the set of her shoulders suggested she had already known more or less how this conversation would go. The books were worse than Vivian had expected. She spent the first morning in Ruth's small office going through the house accounts with the focused, slightly grim attention of someone performing a damage assessment. The previous bookkeeper, the woman who had gone to Denver in February, had been adequate but inconsistent, keeping 2 different recording systems that she apparently switched between at random, which had created the kind of layered confusion that was harder to sort out than simple neglect would have been. The supply store accounts were more organized but had a different problem. 3 months of expenses had been recorded in the wrong columns, which meant the store appeared on paper to be losing money at a rate that would have alarmed any reasonable business owner. It wasn't losing money. It just looked like it was. "You know you've been paying your supply vendor twice for the same deliveries," Vivian said, around noon, looking up from the second ledger. Ruth appeared in the doorway. "I do not know that." "Since January. Every 3rd invoice. Someone is billing you twice and your previous bookkeeper didn't catch it." She turned the ledger to show her. "This one here and this one, same delivery, same date, different invoice numbers. I'd guess the vendor is hoping the second one goes through before anyone notices." Ruth looked at the entries for a long moment. Her expression was controlled in the way that suggested the emotion underneath was not mild. "How much?" $37, as best I can calculate it right now." Ruth pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. "Show me." So Vivian walked her through it systematically, pointing to each duplicate pair. Ruth followed without difficulty. She was clearly intelligent, just stretched too thin to have caught something this subtle while managing everything else. When they reached the end, Ruth sat back and pressed her lips together. "I need to go talk to Harlan Eads," she said. Harlan Eads, Vivian had gathered, was her co-owner of the supply store. And from the tone of Ruth's voice, this was not going to be a pleasant conversation for Harlan Eads. "Do you want me to prepare documentation first?" Vivian asked. "Something you can put in front of him." Ruth looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Do that." It took Vivian 2 hours to prepare a clear summary. Each duplicate invoice listed dates, amounts, a running total, and a brief note on the pattern that made it clearly intentional rather than clerical error on someone's part. She wrote it in the clean, precise hand she'd developed over 6 years of making numbers legible for other people to audit. When she handed it to Ruth, Ruth read through it without speaking, folded it carefully, and put it in her coat pocket. $4 a week, Ruth said, starting today, not Friday. It was not a large sum. It was an acknowledgement, which was different, and Vivian found it mattered more than she would have predicted. The Aldridge house, she came to understand over the first 2 weeks, operated on a principle that Ruth had never articulated directly, but that was visible in everything she did. The assumption that the women under her roof were capable of managing their own circumstances, and that what they needed from her was practical support, not sympathy. She did not ask about feelings. She asked about problems, and then she helped solve them. This suited Vivian almost perfectly because sympathy right now would have undone her, and she couldn't afford to be undone. She had constructed a temporary wall between herself and everything that had happened: the letters, the year of believing, the specific quality of the hope she'd carried onto that train, and she needed the wall to hold while she got her footing. She could feel it behind her all the time, that accumulated weight. She just needed it to stay behind her. Work helped. Work was the best thing she had found, in her 27 years, for keeping the past where it belonged. She spent her mornings at the schoolhouse with Mrs. Fenton, working with the 8 children who were behind in arithmetic. They ranged in age from 7 to 13, and in temperament from eager to actively hostile. And she discovered quickly that the hostile ones were usually hostile because they were embarrassed, because they had reached an age where not understanding something you were supposed to understand already felt like an indictment of something fundamental about you. There was a boy named Henry, 11 years old, the son of a rancher who worked a spread 15 miles outside of town. He was big for his age and wore his confusion as anger, which meant he sat in the back and glared and answered every question put to him with a flat silence that was clearly designed to forestall further questioning. Vivian sat with him on the 4th morning, not at the front of the room where the attention of the other children would have made everything worse, but at a small table in the corner near the window. "I'm not going to make you do it the way the book says," she told him. He looked at her with deep suspicion. "There's only one way. There's usually 3 or 4. The book has one. But if you can get to the right answer, the method belongs to you." She put a simple multiplication problem in front of him. How would you do this one if you could do it any way you wanted? He looked at the problem. Long division, which was where he'd run aground. "I can't," he said. "You can add?" A pause. "Yeah." "So add it instead. What's 8 times 12? Don't multiply. Add 8 12 times and tell me what you get." He looked at her like she'd suggested something vaguely illegal, then picked up his pencil with the deliberate care of someone who didn't want to commit to anything yet. She watched him add, slowly, checking himself. When he got to 96, he looked up. "Right," she said. "That's the same answer." "Yes, but that takes forever." "It does," she agreed. "Which is why eventually you'll want a faster way, but you already know how to do this. You've known how to do this since you were 7. You just didn't know you knew." He looked back at the problem. Something in his posture had changed, very slightly. Not open, not trusting, but less defended. "What's the faster way?" The supply vendor situation resolved itself after Ruth's conversation with Harlan Eads, who turned out to have already suspected something was wrong, but had not wanted to make accusations without documentation. The vendor, confronted with Vivian's written summary and the specific invoice numbers, denied it for approximately 1 hour before Ruth threatened to involve the territorial marshal, at which point a check for $37 appeared with a promptness that confirmed the whole thing had been intentional from the beginning. Vivian heard about this secondhand from Della, who had heard it from someone at the Mercantile who had been present for part of the confrontation. Small towns, she was learning, had their own efficient information systems. Ruth told Harlan the whole thing was caught by her new bookkeeper, Della said over supper. She said it like she was just mentioning it in passing, but she said it in front of 4 people, so now those 4 people know there's someone here who catches things like that. Vivian looked up from her plate. Della smiled. It was a knowing smile, the smile of someone who had lived in Pine Hollow long enough to understand exactly how its social machinery worked. "Ruth doesn't advertise things by accident," she said. "She's letting people know you're available." She was right. Within the week, the owner of Pine Hollow's only hotel came to the Aldridge house asking if the new bookkeeper might be interested in looking at his accounts. The woman who ran the dressmaking shop on the 2nd Street followed 2 days later. By the end of the month, Vivian had 3 additional clients, each paying a modest fee. Not enough to be wealthy, nothing close to that, but enough that the $4 from Ruth felt less like a ceiling and more like a foundation. She was building something. It was small and uncertain and nothing like what she'd imagined when she left Columbus, but it was hers, and that distinction mattered in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. She saw Cole Mercer for the 2nd time on a Saturday, 6 weeks after she'd arrived in Pine Hollow. She was leaving the hotel after finishing the month-end accounts when she nearly walked into him coming down the steps from the opposite direction. He stepped back to make room for her on the narrow board sidewalk, with the automatic courtesy of someone who has good reflexes, and they both stopped. "Miss Hale," he said. "Mr. Mercer?" She adjusted the satchel she was carrying. It had his late mother's ledger books in it, which Ruth had lent her for reference, which felt vaguely circular. "I didn't know you were in town." "Supply run," he said, "every 6 weeks or so." He looked at the satchel with mild curiosity. "You're working." "For the hotel," she said, "and a few others. Your sister introduced me around." "She would," he said, in the tone of a man who was not surprised. There was a pause. Not an uncomfortable one, exactly. More like neither of them was in a particular hurry to fill it. She had thought about him since that night in the saloon, not in a complicated way, more as a fact she kept returning to. He had done something useful and then stepped back from it, and that combination was rarer than people acknowledged. "How are you finding it?" he asked. "Pine Hollow." "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "Different. The space takes some getting used to." The space. The size of everything. In Columbus there were buildings, things to look at every direction. Here you look west and there's just nothing for 30 miles until the mountains. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it. "Not anymore," she said. "I think it did at first. Now it mostly just makes me feel like my problems are the right size." He looked at her with what she was starting to recognize as his default expression. Attentive, not giving much away, but actually listening rather than waiting to speak. It was not a common combination. "That's a useful thing to learn," he said. "I thought so." She shifted the satchel. "How is the ranch?" "Busy. It's calving season." He said it with the neutral affect of someone reporting a weather condition, not complaining, just stating the reality. "It's always something in the spring, I imagine." He nodded once, a slight movement. "I'm glad Ruth had a room," he said. "I wasn't certain she would." "She made it work," Vivian said. "I think she'd have found a way regardless." Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile, but the structural precursor of one. "She would," he said again. He touched the brim of his hat and stepped around her, and she watched him go without quite understanding why she watched, then turned and walked the other way. "Bois?" The spring moved into summer the way seasons did on the frontier. Not gradually, but in lurches. A cold week followed suddenly by heat that felt permanent. The schoolhouse got stuffy in the afternoons, and Mrs. Fenton developed the habit of conducting her classes with both doors propped open, which meant you could hear the lesson from halfway down the street. Henry's arithmetic had improved to the point where Mrs. Fenton had quietly moved him from the remedial group to the general class, an event he pretended not to care about, and which Vivian suspected he cared about more than almost anything that had happened to him that year. He still sat in the back. He still answered questions with a deliberate slowness designed to suggest he was taking his time rather than uncertain. But the hostility was gone, replaced by something more like cautious engagement, the way a dog that has been uncertain about you starts to lean into your hand without quite deciding to commit. His father came to find Vivian one morning in late June. He was a large man named Roy Garrett, no relation to the hotel owner, just the same name, with a face that had been weathered to a kind of geographic roughness, all ridges and angles. He took off his hat when he spoke to her, which she had learned to recognize as a significant gesture from a man like Roy Garrett. "Henry's mother wants to thank you," he said. "I'm here because she can't come herself. She's home with the baby." "He did the work," Vivian said. "I just showed him a different way to look at it." Roy Garrett looked at her directly, in the way of someone who had something specific to say and was deciding how to say it. "He was going to quit school," he said, "at the end of last year. Said he was no good at it and couldn't see the point. I didn't push back as much as I should have." He stopped. "He's not going to quit now. His mother wants you to know that matters." Vivian didn't know what to say to that. She said, "I'm glad he stayed." Roy put his hat back on. "You planning on staying yourself?" he said. "In Pine Hollow?" "I think so," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. Heat. July brought heat and the kind of dry wind that cracked the corners of your lips and made the grass go pale and papery and rustled the curtains of the Aldridge house at all hours. It also brought a letter from the placement agency in Cincinnati. Vivian read it at the kitchen table while Ruth sat across from her with coffee, not pretending not to be interested. The letter was from someone who identified himself as the agency's legal representative. It was carefully written, the kind of careful that legal people practice, where every sentence is a retreat from accountability. And it said, in essence, that the agency had conducted their process in good faith, that the representations made by the individual known as Douglas Merritt had been presented to the agency as legitimate, and that while the agency sympathized deeply with Miss Hale's unfortunate situation, they could not be held responsible for the fraudulent actions of a third party. It also said, at the end, almost as a postscript, that the agency had become aware of several similar complaints and was cooperating fully with the relevant authorities. Vivian read this last paragraph twice. Then she set the letter down on the table. "They're covering themselves," Ruth said. "Yes." She looked at the letter. "But if there are other complaints, it means he did this before. Probably more than once." She felt the old anger move in her chest, still cold, still compressed. "I'd like to know how many women he did this to." "You won't get that information from them." "No." She folded the letter and set it aside. "I'm going to write to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne, and I'm going to write back to the agency and let them know I'm doing it, so they understand that cooperating fully is in their interest." Ruth looked at her over her coffee cup. "You know that probably won't get your $50 back." "I know," Vivian said, "but if there's a record somewhere and he tries to do it again, maybe someone catches him." She paused. "It's not about the money anymore." Ruth said nothing for a moment. Then, "You want help drafting the letter to the marshal?" "I know how to write a letter," Vivian said. "I know you do. I'm offering because I know the marshal's name and I know what he responds to, and that's different from knowing how to write a letter." Vivian looked at her. "All right," she said. "Yes, thank you." Cole came into town again in August, and this time the supply run coincided with a community supper that the church ladies organized once a month at the hall near the schoolhouse. Ruth had told Vivian these suppers were optional, but that everyone went to them, which was Ruth's way of saying they were not optional. So she went, and found herself at a long table with half the town, and Cole was there too, sitting at the other end near Roy Garrett, and two other ranchers she'd met briefly, talking about something to do with fence lines and water rights that she could only partially hear over the general noise. She noticed across the meal that he did not talk much, not in the way of men who had nothing to say, but in the way of men who had learned to be selective. When he did speak, the people around him adjusted slightly, the way you adjust when someone says something worth actually listening to. She had seen that dynamic in offices, in boardrooms of the minor Columbus businesses she'd done accounts for. The person who doesn't talk much, but changes the room when they do. He caught her looking once, and she looked back down at her plate without embarrassment, because she wasn't embarrassed. She was just noting things, accumulating information about the place she'd decided to stay. After supper, when people were milling around in the way of the end of an evening that nobody quite wanted to be the first to end, he came over to where she was stacking dishes with Della. "I heard you wrote to the marshal about Merritt," he said. She looked at him. "Word travels. Ruth mentioned it." "Ah." She handed a stack of plates to Della, who took them to the kitchen with the tact of someone who has learned to be elsewhere. "I don't know if anything will come of it." "Probably not much," he said, "but it's in the record now. That matters if he does it again." "That's what I thought." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "You're not going back to Ohio," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." "What made you decide?" She thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complicated. It was partly economic practicality, partly the fact that there was nothing in Columbus to return to, partly Ruth and Mrs. Fenton and Henry, and the strange growing sense that she was becoming slowly and imperfectly a person who fit somewhere. But the truest answer, the one she wouldn't have said to most people, was simpler than all of that. "One morning, about 2 months ago," she said, "I was walking back from the schoolhouse, and I noticed I'd gone 6 hours without thinking about the letters, about Merritt, about any of it." She looked at the window, the dark outside. That was the first time in months that had happened. And I thought, something is taking up the space where that was. Something real. She paused. It seemed worth staying for. Cole looked at her for a long moment. He had, she'd noticed, the patience to let a silence exist without filling it. "That's a reasonable thing to stay for," he said finally. "I thought so." He picked up a serving dish from the table and handed it to her without being asked, because her hands were empty and there were more dishes to clear, and she took it and they continued working in companionable silence, not talking, not needing to. The summer wore on. August gave way to September, and the light began to change, that particular golden quality of late-season light on the high plains, where everything looks both warmer and slightly elegiac, like the land knows what's coming. The mountains were already showing early snow on the highest peaks. Vivian had 8 accounting clients by September. She had formally taken on half of Mrs. Fenton's arithmetic instruction, 4 mornings a week, for a small but real stipend that the school board had approved after Mrs. Fenton made the case in her characteristically direct way. Henry had passed his arithmetic examination at grade level and had, in a moment of deeply reluctant sentiment, come to tell Vivian this in person, looking at a point approximately 6 inches to the left of her head while he did so. "Thank you," she had said simply. "I didn't need much help," he said immediately. "I know," she said. "You mostly helped yourself." He had nodded, still not quite meeting her eyes, and then left at a speed that suggested the entire interaction had been planned as quickly as possible. She had stood in the schoolhouse doorway watching him go and felt something she didn't entirely have language for, something like pride, but wider than that. Something about permanence, about having made a mark on a place in a way that wouldn't immediately disappear when she left the room. She had not made marks like that in Columbus. In Columbus, she had done good work that was accurate and useful and that other people had depended on, but nobody had ever looked at her the way Henry had looked at her when he reported his examination result. Nobody had ever been embarrassed by their gratitude in a way that made it real. She thought about that in the evenings, sitting by the window in her room while the temperature dropped and the mountains went dark against the sky. She thought about the distinction between being useful and being needed, how she had spent years being the former and had not understood until now that they were different things. She also thought about Cole Mercer, which she had given herself permission to acknowledge as a fact of her inner life without assigning it more importance than it had. She thought about the way he had handed her the serving dish without ceremony, the way he had written to Ruth the same evening they met just in case, the way he sat at community suppers without needing to perform anything for anyone. She was not in love with him. She was clear-eyed enough about the current state of her own heart to know that much. But she was interested in the specific, cautious, eyes-open way that was available to her now after what had happened with the letters. Not the flood of projected hope that had carried her onto that train. Something more measured, a noticing of who he seemed to be, held against the possibility that she might be wrong again, held against the fact that the 2 times she had actually been in the same room with him, he had behaved with a consistency that made her trust what she observed. It was not a grand feeling. It was the feeling of someone who had learned, the hard way, that grand feelings could be manufactured out of nothing, and that the real thing was probably quieter and more inconvenient and less like a story. She put it away, that noticing, and looked at the mountains in the dark, and thought about what she needed to do before the cold really settled in. There were 2 clients whose accounts needed to be consolidated before winter. Mrs. Fenton wanted to plan the spring curriculum before December. The Aldridge house needed a full inventory before the supply runs became difficult. There was enough work to fill the winter. That was fine. That was, she thought, exactly fine. She had come here broken and empty-handed and had spent 6 months building something from nothing, without romance or rescue or any of the things she'd been promised and then denied. The life she had now wasn't the life she'd imagined. It was smaller in some ways and considerably larger in others, and it was hers in a way that the imagined one never could have been, because she had made every piece of it herself, out of what she actually had rather than what she'd hoped for. She was still angry, some days, when something reminded her. She suspected she might always be, in some low-level way, that the anger would just become part of her, the way a break that heals right still leaves a mark in the bone. That was all right. The mark in the bone was proof it healed. Outside, the first frost of the year had settled on the garden, and in the morning the window boxes would be silver with it, and Ruth would make coffee before any of the boarders were up, and Vivian would come downstairs and sit at the kitchen table, and there would be work to do. She reached over and turned down the lamp, and this time she did not fall asleep immediately, but lay in the dark listening to the house and the wind and the enormous quiet of the country around her, and it did not feel threatening or empty. It felt, for the first time since she had stepped off that train, like the quiet of a place where she belonged. The frost that had silvered the garden in October deepened through November into the kind of cold that had real weight to it. Not just temperature, but presence, something you felt in the walls of the house at night and in the particular quality of the silence that came before a hard freeze. Vivian had never experienced a winter like this in Columbus. Columbus winters were gray and damp and unpleasant. This was something different. This was cold that meant business. Ruth walked her through the preparations with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this many times and considered it simply part of the calendar. Extra wood laid in, root cellar checked and restocked, the pipes wrapped where they ran along the outside wall of the kitchen, the garden beds turned and covered. The Aldridge house had good bones, Ruth said. It had weathered worse. Vivian took her word for it and helped with the preparations and tried not to think too much about what worse looked like out here. What she thought about instead, in the stretches between work and sleep, was the letter she had received in late October from the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne. It was not, as she had expected, a dismissal. The deputy marshal who wrote back had been terse but direct. The individual known as Douglas Merritt was already the subject of an active inquiry. There were 4 other complaints. The marshal's office was interested in her documentation. Could she provide a complete accounting of the correspondence and the financial transaction with the placement agency? She had spent 2 evenings composing a careful response, organized chronologically, with every fact she could substantiate clearly noted, and everything she could not clearly marked as her recollection rather than documentation. She sent it with a level of precision she usually reserved for audit work, because she understood that precision was the most useful thing she could offer. She had not heard back since. That was all right. She had done what she could do. What she could not do, what she was learning to accept she could not do, was make the anger finish. It was smaller now than it had been in the summer. It no longer showed up in the middle of ordinary moments the way it had in July, that sudden hot flash of it interrupting the middle of a calculation or a lesson. But it was still there, structural, the way a healed break changes how a bone handles pressure even when you can't see it anymore. She had given herself permission to stop trying to be done with it on any particular schedule. The work helped. The work always helped. And there was more of it now in the shorter days before the real cold set in. Ranching families who had come into town for winter provisions and found, through the efficient information network of Pine Hollow, that there was a woman at the Aldridge house who could look at their accounts and tell them where they actually stood before spring. She had sat across from 7 different families in November, in the parlor that Ruth set aside for her professional consultations, and walked through numbers with men who were accustomed to doing their figuring with a pencil stub and a scrap of brown paper, and who looked at her ledger work with expressions that ranged from respectful to faintly unsettled. The unsettled ones she did not mind. Being underestimated had its practical advantages. Well, the man arrived in Pine Hollow on a Wednesday in early December, when the first real snow of the year had been coming down since morning. Not the heavy, dramatic kind, but the fine, dry, persistent kind that accumulated without announcing itself. Vivian was at the Mercantile picking up a supply order for the Aldridge house when she heard the door open behind her and felt the cold gust of outside air and turned out of habit, and the man standing in the doorway was looking directly at her. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed for the territory, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome in a predictable way 20 years ago and had since become polished in its place, smooth in all the spots where experience should have left marks. He was smiling, and the smile was practiced and warm and told her nothing. "Miss Hale," he said, "what a fortunate coincidence." She looked at him for 3 full seconds, during which she identified that she did not know him, that he knew her name, and that the word coincidence was almost certainly a lie. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "We haven't." He came inside, stamping snow off his boots with the ease of a man who is comfortable making himself at home in other people's spaces. "My name is Francis Webb. I'm a business associate of Douglas Merritt." The name landed in the room like a stone in still water, and she felt the ripples of it move through her chest before her expression had time to do anything about them. She kept her face level. She had been doing accounts for 8 months. She knew how to keep her face level. "Is that right?" she said. "I understand you've had a difficult situation," Webb said, in the tone of a man delivering condolences at a small distance. "That was never the intention. There was a misunderstanding. Douglas genuinely... He paused, recalibrating. The arrangement fell through in a way that wasn't intended to cause harm, and I'm here because he wants to make it right. Vivian set the supply list she was holding down on the counter beside her. She was aware of Della behind the counter, very still, pretending to arrange something on the shelf. Make it right, Vivian said. There's a figure. Webb reached into his coat and produced an envelope, which he held toward her at a respectful distance, not pushing it, the way someone offers something they expect to be taken. To cover your expenses, your travel, your inconvenience, a clean settlement, no further complications. She did not take the envelope. How much? $150. It was more than she'd expected him to offer, which told her something. She looked at the envelope. She looked at Webb's practiced face. She thought about the deputy marshal in Cheyenne and the 4 other women and the letter she had spent 2 evenings composing with all the precision she had. What does a settlement require from me? She said. Webb's expression adjusted fractionally. He had expected her to take the envelope. Simply that you withdraw your complaint with the marshal's office and agree not to pursue the matter further. Simply, she said. It's a clean arrangement. You've clearly established yourself here. You're clearly managing. This would give you a financial foundation to... Mr. Webb, she said. He stopped. I have a question for you. She kept her voice even. The 4 other women, the 4 who also filed complaints, are you making the same offer to them? Something moved behind his eyes. It was quick, and he controlled it quickly, but she saw it. I'm not sure what you... The marshal's office told me there are 4 other complaints, she said. So I'm asking whether Douglas Merritt's remorse is specific to me, or whether you're traveling around making settlements with all of us. The smile had become effortful. Miss Hale, this is a straightforward, keep the money, she said. She picked up her supply list from the counter. I'm not withdrawing anything. Webb looked at her for a long moment. The warmth was gone from his expression now. Not hostile, not threatening, but the absence of performance, just the flat assessment of a man recalculating. You understand, he said, that you're unlikely to recover anything through legal channels. The marshal's office moves slowly. These things rarely... I understand that, she said. I'm still not withdrawing. He pocketed the envelope. He looked at her one more time with the expression of a man who has encountered something he didn't account for. Then he nodded, once, and turned and walked back out into the snow. The door closed. The mercantile was very quiet. Lord, Della said from behind the counter, and then remembered Vivian didn't appreciate that kind of language and said, I mean, are you all right? I'm fine, Vivian said. She was surprised to find this was mostly true. Her hands were steady. The anger was there, but it wasn't running hot. It was still that cold, structural thing, doing its job. Can you finish pulling that order? I need to get back. She told Ruth about Webb over supper, not because she needed advice, but because Ruth had a stake in knowing what came through her door, and because keeping things from Ruth felt both pointless and somewhat disrespectful. Ruth listened without interrupting. You told him no. Yes. Ruth picked up her fork. Good, she said, and continued eating. And that was the full extent of her editorial comment, which was exactly the response Vivian needed. Cole heard about it 3 days later. She did not know how. Probably Ruth. Probably the same efficient small-town channels that moved all information through Pine Hollow. But he appeared at the Aldridge house on a Saturday afternoon, and Ruth showed him into the parlor where Vivian was working on the school board accounts. He sat in the chair across from her without ceremony. Webb came to see you. He did. You turned him down. I did. She set her pen down. I assume you're going to tell me I should have taken the money. No, he said. She looked at him. $150 to drop the complaint means they're worried about the complaint, he said. That's worth more than the money. She had thought the same thing in those 3 seconds before she answered. It was strange to hear it said back to her in the same terms. That's what I thought, she said. Did he threaten you? Not directly. Implied that legal channels were slow and unlikely to produce results. They're slow, Cole said. That part's true. I know. She looked at her accounts. But there are other women. I can't... She stopped. She hadn't quite articulated this to herself in plain language yet. I can't take money to stay quiet about something that's still happening to someone else. I don't know how to do that and still be the person I want to be. Cole was quiet for a moment. He had his hat in his hands, turning it slowly the way he turned his coffee cup. That same habitual motion that seemed to be less about the object and more about giving his hands something to do while he thought. Webb won't come back, he said. But you should know that. What do you mean? He came once. You said no. There's no reason for him to try again. He'll move on. He looked at her. I'm not saying it as a warning. I'm saying it so you're not waiting for something that isn't coming. It was a small, specific, practical thing to say. It was also exactly what she had needed to hear because she had been, underneath everything else, braced for a continuation that would probably not come. Thank you, she said. He stood, put his hat back on. I'm going to bring supplies out to the Hendersons before the weather changes, he said. They're 20 miles out and the wife is expecting. You need anything from Garrison's before I leave town? No, she said. But thank you. He nodded and left, and she sat for a moment looking at the door he'd closed behind him before picking up her pen and returning to the accounts. The weather changed in January with a ferocity that the old-timers called a blue norther, and everyone else just called catastrophic. 3 days of snow that came horizontally, temperature dropping to places that felt theoretical until you stepped outside, the kind of cold that had already killed cattle on 2 ranches west of Pine Hollow before the worst of it even arrived. Cole had ridden out to check the Hendersons 5 days before the storm hit and had not come back to town before it closed in. Vivian knew this because Ruth mentioned it with the specific, careful neutrality she used when she was worried about something she had decided not to perform worry about. He knows that country better than anyone, Ruth said. He's sheltered out before. I know, Vivian said. He'll have headed for the Henderson place or the line cabin on the North Ridge, depending on where he was when it hit. Right, Vivian said. They did not discuss it further. The storm had its own demands, keeping the Aldridge House pipes from freezing, keeping the stove fed, breaking ice on the water pump twice a day. The town was effectively sealed. The supply stage didn't run. Mrs. Fenton sent word that school was suspended until the cold broke, which Vivian thought was probably obvious but appreciated the formality of. She spent the 3 days of the worst of it doing accounts by lamplight and helping Ruth with the house and trying not to think about the North Ridge or what 20 miles in this looked like on horseback. She mostly succeeded. On the 4th day, the wind dropped. On the 5th day, the temperature rose enough to feel like a reprieve, which it wasn't. Winter had just paused to breathe, but the main street of Pine Hollow was passable again, and the stage ran, and 3 ranching families who had been sheltering in town headed back out to see what they had lost. Cole rode back into Pine Hollow on the 5th morning. Vivian saw him from the window of the parlor where she was working, coming down the main street on his horse with the particular deliberate pace of a man and animal that have both been through something and are operating on reserves. He looked from where she stood watching exactly like himself, hat down against the cold, coat dark with damp, moving with that same unhurried economy she'd come to associate with him. He stopped in front of the livery stable and got down and handed his horse off to the stable boy, and that was it. He was back. She did not go out. There was no reason to go out. She went back to her accounts, but she noticed that her hands were steadier than they had been for 5 days, and that she finished the page she'd been working on in 20 minutes when it should have taken 40. The Henderson baby arrived in February. A girl, everyone healthy. The news passed through Pine Hollow in the particular ripple of relief that followed any successful birth in a place where the margin was thin. Cole had brought the doctor out on the day the storm broke, riding the 20 miles himself rather than waiting for the stage, which Vivian heard about from Della, who heard it from the doctor's wife. He didn't even stay, Della said, with a slightly performative exasperation of someone who finds a person's unsentimental goodness faintly maddening. Just delivered the doctor and rode back, didn't wait to see how it came out. He was probably needed at the ranch, Vivian said. He could have waited 1 hour. He could have, Vivian agreed, and privately thought that Cole's version of not waiting was a gift in its own way. He'd done what was needed and left the moment for the family rather than making it about the gesture. She thought about that for a while, in the way she had started to think about him, cataloging, adding to an ongoing assessment that she had not consciously decided to keep but was clearly keeping anyway. The way he handled things, the economy of it, the absence of self-congratulation. She was going to need to decide what she was doing about that, eventually. She understood this. She just hadn't arrived at the point of knowing how. The situation that forced the matter had nothing romantic about it, and everything unexpected. In late February, Cole came to the Aldridge house and asked Ruth if Vivian might be available to come out to the ranch. He said it formally, standing in the front hall with his hat in his hands, and Ruth called up the stairs and Vivian came down, and he explained that he had found a problem in his ranch accounts that he could not sort out himself, and that his foreman had suggested, before inadvisably suggesting anything else and being told to mind his business, that the woman at the Aldridge house was the person to ask. "I can come tomorrow," Vivian said. "I appreciate it," Cole said. "I'll send Tom with the wagon at 8. The ranch was 12 miles out, and she had not been there before. The road was still winter hard, the wagon throwing up clouds of frozen dust where the sun had barely reached the ruts. Tom Briggs drove without speaking, which she had learned was his natural mode, and she sat with her satchel on her lap, watching the country open up around her. The Mercer Ranch was larger than she'd imagined from what Cole had said about it. Not large in the extravagant sense, but substantial, the kind of operation that was clearly the result of serious, sustained effort over many years. The house was solid. 2 stories, well-maintained with the functional plainness of something built to work rather than impress. The yard was organized. The barn was in better repair than the barns of half her clients in town. Cole met her at the house and showed her into a small room off the main hall that served as his office. There was a desk, a chair, a lamp, and 3 years of account books that were in reasonable but inconsistent order. A man who was not bad at figures but who had taught himself rather than been taught, and whose system had evolved in several different directions without ever fully converging. "What's the problem?" she asked, sitting down and pulling the nearest ledger toward her. "I'm missing something," he said, standing near the door with the habitual position of a man who doesn't sit when he can stand. "The cattle numbers at the end of last year don't match the sale records, and I can't find where the discrepancy is. My foreman says the numbers are fine. I think they're not." "How large is the discrepancy?" 17 head? 17 head at current prices was meaningful. "That could be a recording error," she said, "or it could be something else." "Yes," he said. "I know." She looked at him. He looked back steadily, with the directness of a man who had already considered the range of possibilities and didn't need to have them enumerated for him. "Leave me with the books," she said. "I'll start from the beginning of last year." He left. She started from the beginning of last year. It took her 5 hours. The discrepancy was not a recording error, and it was not his foreman, that she could rule out. What it was, at the end of 5 hours, was a pattern of counting errors in the tally records from the summer drive, done by a seasonal hand who was no longer with the ranch and who had either been careless or had been helping someone be careless on purpose. She could not prove the latter from the records, but the pattern was too consistent for her to believe in the former. Cole came back in the late afternoon with coffee, which he set on the desk without asking, and she walked him through what she'd found. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The seasonal hand was hired through Vance Tully's crew." Vance Tully was a name she'd heard in passing, a large ranching operation on the west side of the valley, with a reputation for operating at the edges of what was acceptable. She did not say any of that, because she had learned to be precise about what she could and could not establish from the information in front of her. "The records show what the records show," she said. "What you do with that is your business." He nodded. "I need this documented," he said. "Written up the way you did for Ruth and the supply vendor. Something I can take to people and show." "I can do that," she said. "It'll take another few hours." "You can stay for supper," he said. "Tom will take you back after." She worked until the light outside the window went dark and the lamp became necessary, and then she finished the documentation and went into the kitchen where Cole had apparently made supper himself. Something with salt pork and beans and cornbread, the fundamental frontier meal done without drama. They ate at the kitchen table, and the conversation was about the ranch accounts, more than anything personal, practical questions she had noticed in the ledgers and things he had been meaning to address. It was a comfortable conversation, the kind that happens between people who are doing something together and don't need to work at the talking. "You're good at this," he said at one point, not expansively, but in the same tone he might have said the weather's clearing. "I know," she said. He looked at her, and something at the corner of his mouth shifted. Most people say thank you. Thank you implies it's a surprise, she said. It's not a surprise. I've been good at it for years. He was quiet for a moment. Then, fair enough. She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was specific, the way lamplight is in a room with one lamp and actual dark outside, and his face in it was, she noticed this, filed it, the face of a man who looked the same in private as in public, which was rarer than it should have been. Why did you really write to Ruth that same night? She said. He didn't seem surprised by the question, which meant he'd known she knew, which meant he'd been waiting for her to ask. I told you, he said. She had a room. You wrote the letter before I decided to go, she said. You gave me the address and didn't push it, but you wrote the letter anyway. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. You were going to decide right either way, he said. I didn't want the room being unavailable to be the thing that made the decision wrong. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a very particular thing to do for a stranger, she said. You weren't a stranger by then, he said. We'd had a conversation. One conversation. It was enough of one. He said it simply, not working at it. She did not know what to do with that. She did not have language yet for what she was doing with it internally, the way it was moving things around behind her sternum. She looked at the table and then back at him and then decided, because she was not a woman who had ever been good at pretending she hadn't noticed things, to say it plainly. I'm not ready, she said. I want to be clear about that. What happened? The letters, all of it. I haven't finished deciding what it means, for what I trust, for what I'm willing to. She stopped, chose the more precise word, risk. I know, he said. You know. I wasn't. He paused. I wasn't presenting you with anything. I was answering the question you asked. I know, she said. I just wanted to say it plainly, so it was said. He nodded. They finished supper in a silence that was not uncomfortable, that had the quality of two people who have put something on the table and are sitting with it, rather than rushing to put it away. Tom took her back to Pine Hollow in the dark, the wagon wheels loud on the frozen road, the stars out in the absolutely uncompromising quantity they showed themselves in out here, where there was nothing to compete with them. March came in brutal, as March often did at altitude, one last demonstration of what winter could do before it finally started releasing its hold. There were 2 weeks of hard cold, a last significant snow, and then a stretch of days where the temperature climbed enough that you could feel the ground thinking about it. Cole came back to the ranch, and she did not see him for 3 weeks, which was fine, which was what she had said she needed, which she was not going to manufacture drama about. What happened instead was practical and slightly frightening and made everything else secondary. She had been helping Ruth's neighbor, a widow named Agnes Pratt, sort through her late husband's papers, when she found a series of land documents that did not look right. She was not a lawyer, and she did not know land law with any precision, but she knew how numbers were supposed to behave, and the figures in the documents she was looking at were not behaving. Agnes's husband had died in October and had left her 160 acres of good pasture land on the east side of the valley. The will was clear. The land had been in the Pratt family for 11 years. But there were 2 documents in the stack, dated 3 months before Hiram Pratt's death, that appeared to convey interest in that land to a party called the Consolidated Valley Holdings Company for a consideration that was substantially below market value, in language that was dense and technical in a way that seemed specifically designed to be difficult to read. Agnes looked at the documents when Vivian spread them on the table. I don't understand those, she said. Hiram handled the papers. Did Hiram mention selling any portion of the land? No, never. That land was... No. Agnes looked at Vivian, and her face was the face of someone who is beginning to understand that something has gone wrong and is not yet ready to know how wrong. What does it mean? I don't know yet, Vivian said carefully. I need to take these to someone who does land law. Do you know who does the title registrations for the valley? The county recorder in Garfield, that's 2 towns east. All right. Vivian looked at the documents again. The Consolidated Valley Holdings Company. She had not heard that name before. Can I hold on to these for a few days? Agnes agreed, and Vivian took them back to the Aldridge house and stayed up past midnight reading them 3 times, making careful notes on everything that seemed irregular, then writing a clean summary of what she'd found in the same format she used for her audit work. She brought the summary to Ruth in the morning. Ruth read it in silence. When she finished, she looked up and said, "Consolidated Valley Holdings." "You know it?" "I know the name," Ruth said. "It's been mentioned in connection with Vance Tully." Vivian sat with that for a moment. Vance Tully, whose crew had provided the seasonal hand who had miscounted Cole's cattle. Vance Tully, who operated at the edges of what was acceptable. "How many other families in this valley," she said, slowly, "have land documents they can't fully read?" Ruth looked at her. It was the look of two people arriving at the same place simultaneously. "That," Ruth said, "is a very important question." What happened next consumed the better part of 6 weeks, during which Vivian did almost nothing except work. She went door to door. Not to every ranch because the roads were still difficult in March, and she had no horse of her own, but to every family she had worked with, every client who trusted her, every woman in the valley who answered when Ruth's name was mentioned. She asked them to show her their land papers. Out of 19 families she visited, she found irregular documents in 7. It was not a small number. It was not a coincidence. It was a pattern, and the pattern had a shape. And the shape, when she laid all 19 sets of documents side by side on the long dining room table of the Aldridge house on a Sunday afternoon in early April, was unmistakable. The Consolidated Valley Holdings Company was systematically acquiring rights to the most valuable land in the eastern Pine Hollow Valley through documents that had been signed without the landowners fully understanding what they were signing. Cole arrived at the Aldridge house that Sunday because Ruth had sent for him. He stood at the end of the table and looked at the documents spread across it, and then at Vivian, who had been working since dawn and had ink on her fingers and probably looked approximately as organized as she felt, which was completely organized but also exhausted. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Systematically, from the first anomaly in Agnes Pratt's papers through to the full pattern as she had mapped it, with her summary documents and her timeline and her annotated copies of the most significant documents laid out in order. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, following everything. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This is enough to take to a lawyer," he said. "It's enough to take to the Territorial Land Office," she said, "which is more important. These filings should have been registered. Some of them are, and some of them aren't, which may mean the recordings themselves were fraudulent, which is a different category of problem." "You know land law," he said. "I know how records are supposed to work," she said. "I've spent 3 weeks learning how land records specifically are supposed to work. I was motivated." He looked at the documents, then he looked at her. "You did all of this?" he said. "Ruth helped." "Ruth helped," he said. "But this was you." She didn't deflect it. "Yes," she said. "This was mostly me." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, not exactly. More like something that had been held at a careful distance being allowed a step closer. "We need to get this to a lawyer in Garfield," he said, "and to the Territorial Land Office simultaneously. And we need to do it before Tully's people realize someone has been looking at these papers." "I know," she said. "How fast can you get to Garfield?" "Half a day if I leave early." "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," he said. The next 3 weeks moved with the specific tension of a situation that might resolve itself well or badly, depending on factors only partially in anyone's control. Cole rode to Garfield with Vivian's documentation and the original documents Agnes Pratt had provided. The lawyer there, a man named Clive Sanderson, who had a reputation for being thorough in the slow way that thorough lawyers often are, spent 4 days reviewing everything before confirming what Vivian had already identified. The documents were irregular, the recording process had been improperly handled, and there was sufficient basis for a formal challenge at the territorial level. What happened with Vance Tully after that was mostly out of Vivian's hands, which she accepted because she had done the part that was hers to do. There were hearings. There was a period of uncertainty during which 3 of the 7 affected families were understandably frightened. There was eventually a ruling from the Territorial Land Office that the Consolidated Valley Holdings Company's filings were invalid for procedural irregularities, and while that ruling was not the end of the legal matter, it was enough to stop the immediate threat and put the burden of proof somewhere other than on the people who had almost lost their land. Cole came back from Garfield the night after the initial ruling, and it was late April by then, the air finally starting to smell like it meant it about spring. and Vivian was sitting on the porch of the Aldridge house because the evenings were finally warm enough for that. He tied up his horse and came to the porch and sat on the step below her, and she handed him the coffee she'd been holding because she'd been cold enough to want it, but was now past cold. He took it without comment. "Sanderson says it'll hold," he said. "I thought it would." "7 families," he said. "That's a lot of land." "It is," she said. He looked out at the main street, quiet in the late evening, the lights in the windows of the buildings across the way. "Vivian," he said. She waited. "I said before that I wasn't presenting you with anything." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I'm going to revise that." She felt something move in her chest. Not panic. Something more like the sensation of a door that has been standing ajar, finally being opened by the person who is always going to open it. "All right," she said. "I don't know how to do this particularly gracefully," he said. "I'm aware of what happened to you, and I'm aware that asking you to trust something that looks like, to ask anything at all, has a context it wouldn't otherwise have. I want you to know I'm aware of that." "I know you are," she said. "I've been aware of it since the night in the saloon," he said, "which is why I've been careful. I didn't want to be one more thing you had to manage." She looked at him for a moment. He was looking at the street, not at her, which meant he was not performing this. He was just saying it. "You've been a lot of things," she said quietly. "One more thing to manage isn't one of them." He looked at her then. "I'm still careful," she said. "I'm always going to be careful now. I don't think that goes away." She looked at her hands in her lap. "But careful doesn't mean closed. I didn't come here to be closed." He was quiet for long enough that she listened to the street, the distant sound of horses, the particular night sounds of a frontier town settling towards sleep. "Then I'll ask you," he said, "if you'd like to have supper with me next time I come into town. Not as a client, not as Ruth's boarder." She looked at him. The warm light from the window lay across the porch between them, and the mountains to the west were a dark line against a sky that still held the last memory of sunset. "Yes," she said. "I would." He nodded once, the way he always nodded when something had been decided and settled. He finished the coffee and handed her back the cup and stood, and untied his horse, and rode back toward the road. She sat on the porch for a while after he was gone, holding the empty cup, listening to the spring night, thinking about the difference between a year ago and right now, the particular unbridgeable distance between the woman who had stepped off that train believing in letters and the woman sitting here in the dark, having just said yes to something real and uncertain and hers. It was not a grand feeling. It was a solid one. It sat in her chest without performing anything, without asking anything of her except to let it be there. She let it be there. Then she went inside, because the night had turned cold again the way spring nights do, and there was still work in the morning. The supper he had asked her to happened on a Thursday in early May, at the only restaurant in Pine Hollow that could reasonably be called a restaurant, a narrow room behind the bakery run by a woman named Edna Marsh, who served 3 things and served them well and had the good sense not to try for a 4th. Cole arrived exactly when he said he would, which Vivian had already learned to expect but still noticed, and they sat at the table near the window with the early spring light coming through it and talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with accounts or land documents or anything that required her professional judgment. It was strange, in a good way, to be in his company with nothing to solve. He was not a man who talked about himself easily, not in the way of someone with something to hide, but in the way of someone who had never been particularly encouraged to consider his own interior life worth reporting. He answered her questions directly and without elaboration, and then turned them back to her, which she found she didn't mind because she had spent the last year becoming someone with things worth talking about. She told him about Columbus in a way she hadn't told anyone here. Not just the facts of it, but the specific texture of it, the bakery smell coming through the floor in the mornings, the way the light in Ohio in January was the particular gray of old pewter, the feeling of being a competent person in a life that was too small for the competence. He listened in the way that meant he was actually tracking it, not just waiting for a pause. "Did you always know you wanted to leave?" he asked. "I knew something was wrong with staying," she said. "That's not quite the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him across the table. "What about you? You've been here your whole life." "Born here," he said. "Came with my parents when I was 4. This was all, he made a gesture at the window, the country beyond it. Different then. Fewer people. Rougher. Do you ever want to be somewhere else? He thought about it with the genuine consideration he gave everything. No, he said. I've been to Denver twice. I've been to Cheyenne. I understand why some people want those places. He looked at his coffee. This is mine. I don't mean that in a... He stopped, found the word, possessive way. I mean, I know it. I know how it behaves in different seasons. I know where the water runs in a drought year. I know which families can be counted on and which ones can't. That knowing took a long time. He looked at her. That's worth something to me. She understood that precisely. It was what she had been building, in her smaller way, for the past year. The knowledge that came from staying somewhere long enough to understand it. I think I'm starting to understand it, she said. You are, he said, simply, without flattery. She looked at her plate and then back at him and made the small internal decision that she had been approaching for several weeks. To let this be what it appeared to be, and to stop auditing it. They had supper together twice more in May, and by June it was understood between them and in the way of small towns, by most of Pine Hollow as well, that Cole Mercer and Vivian Hale were something to each other. Nobody made a production of this. Even Della, who had opinions about everything, restricted herself to a single "I knew it," delivered with such satisfaction that Vivian couldn't bring herself to be irritated by it. Ruth said nothing, which was Ruth's way of approving. The Consolidated Valley Holdings matter moved through the spring with the slow, grinding momentum of legal processes, which is to say it moved less quickly than anyone wanted and more conclusively than Vivian had feared. Clive Sanderson and Garfield filed the formal challenge in April. The Territorial Land Office reviewed it in May. In June, a ruling came down that invalidated all 7 contested filings on the grounds of procedural irregularity in the recording process, which was the polite legal language for what Vivian had identified as documents that were designed to be signed without being understood. Vance Tully did not come to Pine Hollow. He sent a lawyer who came once, spoke to no one useful, and left. The Consolidated Valley Holdings Company ceased operating, or at least ceased operating under that name, which was not the same thing and everyone knew it, but the land was clear and the families kept what was theirs, and that was what mattered immediately. Agnes Pratt came to the Aldridge house when the ruling came through and sat in Ruth's kitchen and wept with the specific, exhausted relief of someone who has been holding a terrible possibility at a careful distance for months and is finally allowed to put it down. Vivian sat with her and didn't say much because there wasn't much to say. She brought coffee and Agnes drank it and eventually stopped crying and said, "What do I owe you for all of this?" And Vivian said, "Nothing," and meant it, because the accounting work she'd done for Agnes's documents had been at her own election, and she was not going to bill a widow for the work of protecting her own land. Agnes looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was complicated and tired and genuine. "You came here a year ago," she said, "with nothing." "With $4.60, Vivian said. "And now you've done this." Agnes shook her head. "The woman people were talking about in town. The Eastern woman who got swindled. That's not who you are." "I know who I am," Vivian said. She said it without heat, just plain, and she realized, saying it, that it was simply true in a way it hadn't been true when she stepped off the train in Redstone Crossing. She had known her competencies then. She hadn't known, not yet, how they translated into someone the world would have to deal with. She knew now. Cole proposed on a Sunday in late July, and it was nothing like the proposal in any of Douglas Merritt's letters, which she recognized as exactly right. They had ridden out to the north ridge of the ranch after the noon meal. She had been riding regularly since April, learning on a patient quarter horse named Dusk that Cole had decided was suitable for someone who was starting from nothing, which she had objected to until she fell off twice in the first week and conceded the point. The ridge looked west toward the mountains, and in July the mountains were the particular deep blue-green of high summer, snowcap reduced to just the highest peaks. He had stopped his horse, and she had stopped hers beside him, and they'd sat for a while just looking, which was something they had learned to do together without needing it to be anything more than what it was. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "I want you to know that I understand what I'm asking," he said. "I know what the last time cost you. I'm not asking you to forget that happened or to trust that it didn't teach you something real. I'm asking you, he stopped, and in the pause she could see him finding the language he meant rather than the language that was easier. To consider that what we've built is something different and that I know what it is and that I want to keep building it. She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved the grass on the ridge and the mountains were blue in the distance, and she thought about the letters, the beautiful, elaborate letters that had told her such specific things and had been made of nothing. She thought about a man who handed her a serving dish without being asked, who wrote to his sister before she'd decided to come, who rode 20 miles in a storm to bring a doctor to a family he barely knew and didn't stay for the thanks. "Yes," she said. "I'll consider it." He looked at her. "Cole," she said, and something in her chest did the thing it had been doing around him for months, that particular involuntary loosening. "Yes." He nodded. Just once. Just the way he always nodded when something was settled. They sat on the ridge for another 20 minutes, not talking, just being in the same place in the summer air, and then rode back down to the ranch, and that was that. They married in September, in the Pine Hollow Hall where the community suppers were held, because Ruth had pointed out that if they married anywhere smaller, half the valley would be standing outside straining to hear through the walls, and it was more dignified to simply account for the reality. There was no elaborate ceremony. Mrs. Fenton cried with typical precision. 2 tears, controlled, quickly managed. Henry Garrett sat in the second row with his father Roy and watched the whole proceeding with the serious face of a boy who understood this was significant without fully knowing why. Ruth stood up with Vivian because there was no one else Vivian would have asked, and because Ruth was the kind of woman who stood up for things when she decided they were worth standing up for. Afterward, when the hall had been cleared and the last of the food put away and the guests dispersed in the way of small-town evening, Vivian and Cole drove out to the ranch in the early dark, and she looked at the house, the solid 2-story house Cole had built over 3 summers, and thought, this is real. Not in the way she'd thought things were real before, imposed over absence. Real, the way the mountain was real. Real, because she had touched all the edges of it, and they were there. The first year of marriage was not easy, which was something nobody told you, and which, in retrospect, Vivian understood was simply the truth of combining 2 people who had both been managing alone for a long time and had developed their own systems for everything. Cole's system for the ranch accounts was not wrong, but it was not hers, and the collision of 2 logical but incompatible frameworks created friction neither of them had anticipated. He had a way of making decisions, quickly, with the confidence of long experience and deep knowledge of his specific land, that she sometimes found insufficiently deliberated. She had a way of needing to understand all the variables before committing to a course that he sometimes found, with the patience of a man who chose his words carefully, thorough. "You think I'm slow," she said, on an evening in their second month when this had come to a particular head over the question of whether to buy a neighboring parcel that had come available. "I think," he said, "that some decisions have a time component that changes whether the decision is right or wrong. And I think," she said, "that buying land without looking at the full picture is exactly how 7 families in this valley nearly lost what they had." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not the same situation." "No?" she agreed. "But my instinct is to look at everything first, and yours is to act, and I'm not sure which of us needs to adjust. Probably both," he said. She looked at him. He looked back with the specific expression of a man who finds an argument that ends in mutual concession more comfortable than one that produces a winner. "All right," she said. "Show me why this parcel is the right one." He showed her. She spent 2 days reviewing it, identified 2 concerns he hadn't considered, and 1 significant advantage he had, and they made an offer that accounted for all 3. The offer was accepted. It was not a perfect process. It was theirs. The parcel they acquired in October that first year was 80 acres of good pasture on the eastern border of the Mercer property, and it was the first of what would eventually be several expansions, though none of them knew that yet. What they knew was that the winter of their first year was hard, a sustained cold that started in November and didn't release until March, and that the expanded grazing land turned out to be essential for moving cattle away from the areas where the snowpack sat deepest. Vivian managed the finances through that winter with the meticulous attention she brought to everything, and discovered three things in the process: that the ranch's expenses were well controlled, but its revenue could be considerably improved by timing cattle sales differently; that the breeding program Cole had been running on instinct for years was actually more scientifically sound than he knew, but hadn't been documented in a way that let him leverage it when selling breeding stock; and that the equipment costs for the following year were going to require a credit arrangement, unless they either reduced expenses somewhere or generated additional income from somewhere unexpected. She brought all three of these to Cole in February, when the worst of the cold had eased enough to sit in the kitchen without keeping their coats on, with her usual ledger pages spread on the table. He looked at the pages in his careful way. "You want to change the sale timing," he said. "I want us to change the sale timing," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "What's the difference?" "I want you to tell me why the current timing exists before I argue for changing it. If there's a reason I haven't accounted for, I need to know it." He was quiet for a moment. "You think like a lawyer," he said, not as a criticism. "I think like someone who learned the hard way that information you don't have is the most dangerous kind," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair enough." He pulled the page toward him. "The current timing comes from when my father ran the operation. He sold in August because that's when the buyers came through. The buyers' patterns have shifted since then. There are more markets now. The railroads changed the distribution routes." He looked at the page. "You may be right that September prices are better." "They are," she said. "I've been comparing against what Roy Garrett gets for his stock and he sells in September." Cole looked up. "You've been looking at Roy's numbers?" "Roy offered to show me," she said. "Last fall. He said he thought you'd been selling too early for years but didn't want to say anything." Cole looked at the ceiling in the specific way of a man receiving information that is useful but mildly irritating to have not possessed earlier. "Roy Garrett," he said. "He meant well." "He always means well," Cole said. "All right, September sales. What else?" What else took 2 hours and resulted in a document she titled simply 1879 Operations that laid out every change they intended to make, with the rationale for each, in the precise language she had developed for documents intended to be both record and reference. Cole read it through when she finished it, making 2 small corrections for factual details she'd gotten slightly wrong about the specific cattle breeds, and then said, "This is useful." "I know," she said. He looked at her across the table. "You always know," he said, and this time there was something specific in the way he said it. Not teasing, not quite, but something warm under it, the particular warmth of someone who has come to understand a quality in a person and find it one of the things they are glad is there. The school started in the fall of their second year. It had not been planned in any formal sense. What happened was that Ruth mentioned, at a supper in July, that 2 ranch families on the east side of the valley had pulled their children from the Pine Hollow school because the 12-mile ride each way had become impractical, and that she was aware of at least 3 other families farther out who had never enrolled their children at all because the distance was simply impossible. Vivian had listened to this with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth and put it down and said, "How many children total?" "Across those families?" Ruth did the count. 14 that I know of. "Where's the approximate center of those families geographically?" Ruth had looked at her with an expression that was not surprised but was knowing, the look of a woman who had been waiting to see when a particular idea would land. "About 8 miles northeast of the ranch," she said. Cole had been listening from the end of the table. He said nothing. "There must be a building," Vivian said. "Somebody's old barn, a storage structure, something that could be made adequate." "The old Hanover homestead," Cole said. "Hanover family moved to Laramie 2 years ago. The house is still standing. I've been meaning to deal with the property." She had looked at him. He had looked back with that specific expression she'd learned, the one that meant he'd been ahead of her by about 30 seconds and had been waiting for her to arrive. "Could it be made into a schoolroom?" she asked. "Walls are solid," he said. "Roof needs work. Windows are adequate." He considered. 4 days of work, maybe 5. "Mrs. Fenton would help me plan the curriculum," Vivian said. "I'd need to be there 2 days a week at minimum. 3 would be better. That means I'd need the wagon." "I know," he said. "And we'd need to find materials, books, slates. It doesn't have to be elaborate." "I know," he said again. "Cole," she said. "I'm already calculating the roof repair," he said. The Hanover Schoolhouse, as it came to be called. Nobody had a better name for it, and the name stuck with the permanent adhesion of things that are just called what they obviously are. Opened in September of 1879 with 11 students, 3 slates short of what Vivian had wanted, and a roof that Cole had repaired in 3 days rather than 4. She taught there on Tuesdays and Thursdays and alternating Fridays, riding out with Tom Briggs in the wagon while Cole ran the morning operations without her. And the rhythm of it was imperfect and sometimes exhausting and exactly what she had wanted to be doing. The students ranged from 6 to 15 and arrived with the full spectrum of preparation that implied. The 6-year-olds open and malleable, and sometimes frankly terrifying in the blankness of what they didn't yet know. The 15-year-old, a girl named Carla Reyes, defensive about her gaps in the way Henry had once been defensive, softening in the same way once she understood that the work was about function, not judgment. Carla was the daughter of a Mexican ranching family who had been in the valley longer than most of the Anglo families, but who existed in the particular social margin that implied, not quite excluded but not quite included, both things at once and neither fully. She was sharp and quick, and had been managing her family's accounts in her head without any formal framework for 3 years, because nobody had thought to teach her a formal framework. Vivian spent 6 weeks teaching her double-entry bookkeeping, which was arguably more than the school's stated curriculum included, but which she judged to be the most immediately useful thing she could teach a 15-year-old who was clearly going to end up running something. Carla's father, Emilio Reyes, came to the school one afternoon in November to speak to her. He was a compact, careful man who held his hat with both hands when he stood indoors, and who looked at her with the specific wariness of someone who has learned to assess unfamiliar situations before committing to a response. "My daughter can balance our books now," he said. "Found an error my brother had been making for 2 years. She would have figured it out on her own eventually," Vivian said. "She just needed the vocabulary." "You taught her like it mattered," he said. "It does matter." He looked at her for a moment. "People in this valley weren't sure about you," he said, with the directness of someone who has decided honesty is worth the awkwardness. "When you first came, the story, what happened at Redstone Crossing, there was talk." "I know," she said. "The talk is different now." "I know that too," she said. He nodded once, put his hat on, and left. She turned back to her students and kept teaching. But the summer of 1880 brought drought. Not the dramatic sudden kind, the slow, grinding kind that started with a dry April and by July had turned the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the Mercer property from a reliable water source to a thin thread of itself that wouldn't sustain the cattle numbers they'd been planning for. Cole saw it coming in June, which was earlier than most ranchers in the valley acknowledged the possibility, and made the first hard decision of the dry year. They would reduce the herd by a third through early sale rather than carry more animals into summer on insufficient water. It was a decision that cost them projected revenue and that several neighboring ranchers thought was premature, right up until August when those ranchers were also selling cattle, at worse prices, into a market that now knew about the drought. Vivian had been the one to run the numbers in June. She had put the projections in front of Cole and said, "If we sell early, we lose this. If we don't, we risk losing this." She'd pointed at the 2 figures. The difference between them was significant. The risk column was bigger. Cole had looked at the numbers for a long time. "Roy Garrett won't sell early," he said. "I know. He'll hold out and hope the creek recovers." "Yes. And if it does recover, we'll have sold a third of our herd unnecessarily." "Yes," she said. "That's the other outcome." He had looked at her. "What does your instinct say?" She had considered this carefully because she was not a woman who answered that question lightly anymore. "My instinct says the creek won't recover," she said. "But my instinct is based on 1 year of reading this specific land, and yours is based on 15. He looked at the projections again. "Sell," he said. He was right. The creek did not recover. By August, it was a dry bed, and 3 ranchers to the west of them lost cattle they couldn't move fast enough to better water, and Roy Garrett sold in September into a collapsed market and spent the winter recalculating. He came to the ranch in October, Roy Garrett did, and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and didn't quite say he should have listened because Roy Garrett was not built for that particular speech, but he stayed for 2 hours and let Vivian walk him through the projection methodology she'd used, asking careful questions, and that was its own version of the same thing. "How'd you know?" he said finally. "I didn't know," she said. "I calculated what we could afford to be wrong about." He looked at her. "That's a useful way to think." "It's the only way I know," she said. After Roy left, Cole came into the kitchen and refilled his coffee and stood at the window looking out at the yard. "Roy Garrett just sat at my wife's table and let her explain risk assessment to him," he said. "He did," she said. "Roy Garrett," he said again. "He's smarter than people give him credit for," she said. "He just needed the framework." Cole looked at her with that warm, specific look, the one that had particular frequency in the 3rd year of their marriage, like something that had been warming slowly, had reached the temperature where it was just always going to be that way. "You know what you do?" he said. "Run the accounts?" she offered. "You give people frameworks," he said, "for their numbers, for their land documents, for their kids' arithmetic. You come in and you show people how to think about the thing they've been staring at and couldn't see." She considered this. "Is that what I do?" "That's what you do," he said. She thought about Columbus, about the bookkeeper's office and the rented room and the life that had been too small. She thought about the train and the empty platform and the $4.60. "I didn't know I could do it at scale," she said quietly. "Neither did I," he said, "but I wasn't surprised." The winter of 1880 was more manageable than the winter of their first year, partly because they knew more about what to prepare for, and partly because the reduced herd meant fewer animals to manage through the worst of it. Vivian spent the long evenings working on a document she had been building since September, a comprehensive accounting of the valley's ranching operations. Not other people's private numbers, but aggregated patterns, the kinds of things that were visible when you'd done the books for 15 families and could see the common pressures and the common solutions. She had begun thinking about it initially as something for herself, a reference. But the more she built it, the more it looked like something that should be shared. A practical guide for frontier ranching families on how to think about their finances, written plainly enough to be useful to someone who had never opened an accounting textbook, which described most of the people she was thinking about. She told Cole about it in January, in the way she told him things that were not yet decided, not asking for permission, but thinking out loud in his company because he was useful to think out loud with. "A guide," he said. "Practical financial management for ranching operations," she said, "specific to this territory. The kinds of things I had to figure out because nobody wrote them down." "You want to write them down?" "I want them to exist," she said. "I'll write them." He was quiet for a moment. "That's going to take time." "I have winters," she said. He looked at her across the table. "You know what that becomes," he said. "If you write it and people read it, what does it become?" "Another reason people come to you," he said. "Another thing you're responsible for helping with." She had already considered this. "Yes," she said. He looked at her steadily. "And you want that?" "I want this valley to be the kind of place where people have what they need to survive it," she said. "I nearly didn't have it. I don't want that for other people, if I can help it." He nodded once, the nod of settled things. "Use the office," he said. "I'll move the old ledgers to the barn." "You don't need to move the ledgers. You need the shelf space," he said. And that was that. The guide was finished by March of 1881 and was not, in its final form, the tidy professional document she had imagined at the start. It was messier than that, full of specific examples drawn from real situations she had anonymized, with footnotes that argued with themselves and sections that she'd rewritten 4 times, and sections that she'd left rough, because rough was more honest than polished when the subject was how hard this life actually was. Cole read the whole thing over 2 evenings and made 6 comments, 4 of which were corrections of factual details about cattle operations, one of which was a suggestion about structure that she agreed with, and one of which was written in the margin of the 3rd page in his careful handwriting. "This is good." She had looked at that margin note for a long time. She had it copied in Pine Hollow by the man who ran the print shop there, 50 copies at his best rate, and she gave them away at the spring community supper in April. They were taken with varying degrees of understanding about what they were. Some people thanked her vaguely, Some people started reading immediately and looked up with specific questions. Roy Garrett read the drought chapter and didn't say anything for a while, and then said, "This should have existed 3 years ago." "I know," she said. "That's why I wrote it." Emilio Reyes took 2 copies without explanation. She found out 6 months later that he had given one to a ranching family 20 miles south who had been struggling, people she'd never met, and that they had used the section on credit and cash flow to restructure an arrangement that had been slowly consuming them. She thought about that for a long time, about distance, about the particular way useful things travel once you let them go. By the fall of 1881, the Mercer Ranch was the largest single operation in the Pine Hollow Valley. This was not a fact Vivian had sought. It was a fact that had arrived through consistent decisions made over 3 years of working the numbers carefully and taking the risks that were worth taking and refusing the ones that weren't. The additional pasture parcels they'd acquired, the improved sale timing, the breeding stock program she'd documented, and that Cole had refined into something worth significant money to ranchers as far as Garfield. All of it had accumulated into something neither of them had specifically planned, but both recognized when they saw it. Cole stood on the porch one evening in September and looked at the valley laid out below the ridge and said, "My father would not believe this." "Would he be pleased?" she asked. Cole considered it. "He'd be skeptical," he said. He was always skeptical. He thought the valley was too hard to make much from. He paused. "He wasn't wrong about how hard it is." "No," she said. "He just didn't know what else was available." Cole looked at her. Then he put his arm around her, which was not a thing he did with any performance of it, but which he had taken to doing in the evenings on the porch, with a casualness that she had come to understand was its own kind of statement. The ease of a man who is where he means to be, with the person he means to be with. "What else is available?" he repeated. "People who can do the parts you can't," she said. "That's all." "That's not a small thing." "No," she agreed, "it's not a small thing." Below them, the valley was going to its evening colors, the grass gold and the shadows long, and the mountains taking on the particular blue of September dusk. The school she had built was 8 miles out and had 17 students now, and was going to need another teacher by spring. The guide she had written was on the table of at least a dozen ranching families she knew of, and probably more she didn't. The accounts she managed encompassed 4 ranch operations, and the Pine Hollow supply business, and the hotel, and 3 other commercial enterprises. And she had started quietly, showing Carla Reyes how to do it so that when Carla was 20, there would be someone else who could. It was not the life she had imagined on the train from Columbus. It was so much more complicated than that, and so much less romantic, and so much more genuinely hers that the comparison almost didn't make sense. She had come here to belong to someone, and had ended up belonging somewhere, which was a different and more durable thing. The porch light came on in the window behind them. Ruth had sent her a lamp when they married, a good one that gave off steady light, and it sat in that window every evening like a kind of fixed point. She looked at it now and thought about all the people whose lamps were lit across the valley at this hour, families in the houses she'd visited, and the schools she'd built and the ranches whose numbers she knew by heart. "We should go in," Cole said. "It's getting cold." "In a minute," she said. He didn't push it. He stood with her in the cooling air while the last light went out of the sky, and the stars came out over the mountains in the quantity they always did out here, the full weight of them, undiminished by anything. She had $4.60 once. She had come here with nothing and had built something from nothing, piece by piece, in the way that things that last are always built. Not all at once, and not without cost, but steadily, with attention, by someone who had decided the building was worth doing. She leaned into Cole's arm and looked at the stars. It was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough, and she knew it, and she did not take it for granted, not even for a minute. The winter of 1882 came in quietly, the way the worst things sometimes do. Not with the dramatic announcement of a blue norther, but with a slow, steady cold that settled over the valley like something that intended to stay. By December, the creek had frozen solid for the first time in 4 years. And by January, the snow was deep enough that the wagon road to the Hanover schoolhouse was impassable for 2 weeks straight. Vivian was 7 months pregnant and had been told by the doctor in Pine Hollow, a careful man named Aldous Webb, who had no relation to Francis Webb and who had the bedside manner of someone who delivered bad news frequently enough to have developed a system for it, that she should reduce her workload. She had listened to this recommendation with the respectful attention she gave all professional opinions and had reduced her schoolhouse visits from 3 days a week to 2, which was the extent of the adjustment she was prepared to make. Cole had not argued with her about this, which she appreciated. He had said once, "The doctor said reduce, not eliminate," and she had said, "I know what the doctor said," and that had been the conversation in its entirety. He had his limits. She had hers. They had learned over 3 years of marriage to identify the places where those limits needed to be negotiated and the places where they needed to be left alone. This was one of the latter. She taught at the Hanover School on Tuesdays and Thursdays, bundled into a coat that no longer buttoned properly and transported by Tom Briggs in the wagon with the patience of a man who understood his role in the logistics of the Mercer household. The 17 students who attended had grown accustomed to her changed silhouette and had, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children often apply to things adults find awkward, simply incorporated it into their understanding of how the school worked. Carla Reyes, who was 17 now and had been helping with the younger students since September, had taken on 2 of the arithmetic classes without being asked, in the seamless way of someone who sees a gap and fills it without requiring it to be formally recognized first. Vivian noticed this and said nothing except, one Thursday afternoon after the students had gone, "You're a good teacher." Carla looked up from the slates she was stacking. "I'm just doing what you do." "No," Vivian said. "You're doing what you do. That's different." She looked at the girl. Young woman, she corrected herself. Carla was 17 and could manage a classroom and her family's accounts, and would be going to Garfield in the spring to apprentice with Clive Sanderson, who had agreed, after a letter from Vivian that pulled no punches about Carla's abilities, to take her on. "When I'm gone after the baby, you'll manage the school." "Mrs. Fenton said she'd come out twice a week." "I know, but you'll manage it." She said it as fact, not encouragement, because Carla had long since passed the point where she needed encouragement and had arrived at the point where she needed to be told the truth. "You understand what this school is for. Not everyone does." Carla was quiet for a moment. "What is it for?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely asking, the question of someone who wants to know if her understanding matches the person who built the thing. To make sure that whether someone's parents can afford the ride to Pine Hollow doesn't determine whether they can read a contract, Vivian said. "That's all. Everything else follows from that." Carla looked at the slates in her hands. "My father couldn't read the contract," she said. "When my grandfather bought our land, he signed what they told him to sign." "I know," Vivian said. "A lot of families here have that story." She pulled on her coat with the difficulty that had become part of every small physical task in the last month. "That's why the school has to work." Eleanor Mercer was born on a Friday morning in February, in the bedroom of the ranch house, with the doctor present and Cole in the hallway, because he had been asked to wait there and had complied with the specific rigid compliance of a man who would rather be doing something useful and has no useful thing to do. Vivian had not anticipated that birth would be the hardest physical thing she had ever done. She had anticipated that it would be difficult. She had not anticipated the specific quality of the difficulty, which was that it removed every framework she had and left her with nothing but the immediate moment over and over for 11 hours. She was not a person who was comfortable with the absence of frameworks. She was also not a person who quit. When it was done and the doctor put the baby in her arms, and the morning light was coming through the bedroom window at an angle that made everything look both ordinary and entirely strange, she looked at Eleanor's face, red and crumpled and aggressively new, the face of someone who has arrived under difficult circumstances and has opinions about it, and felt something she did not have language for. Not the overwhelming flood she had read about in the women's magazines. Something quieter and more fundamental, like a door opening into a room she hadn't known was there. Cole came in when the doctor called him. He stood beside the bed and looked at the baby, and then at Vivian, and his face did the thing it almost never did in company. It went entirely unguarded, all the careful deliberateness of it just gone, replaced by something so simple and direct that she looked away for a moment because it felt like seeing something private. "Eleanor," she said, because they had decided on the name in November and she wanted to hear it said out loud in this room. "Eleanor," he repeated. The baby made a sound that was not quite crying, more of an editorial comment on the general situation. Cole reached out and put one large, weather-roughened hand very carefully against the side of the baby's head. The same hand that could rope a steer or repair a roof in 3 days, now moving with an attention so precise it looked like a different kind of skill entirely. "She's real," he said. "She is," Vivian agreed. But the spring came late that year, as if it was waiting for something, and arrived all at once in mid-April with the particular force of seasons that have been held back too long. The creek ran full, the grass came up fast, the mountains lost their snowcap down to the permanent line and no lower. Vivian was back at the Hanover school by May, which was 2 weeks earlier than the doctor had recommended, and 3 weeks earlier than Cole had been hoping for, and she managed the transition by agreeing without being asked to have Tom drive her, rather than attempting it on horseback, which was the kind of voluntary concession she was willing to make to keep other arguments from becoming necessary. Eleanor came with her, in the woven basket that had belonged to Ruth, and that Ruth had sent out without comment, which was Ruth's way of sending love. The older girls at the school took turns holding the baby with the concentrated seriousness of people performing an important task, and Carla managed the transfer with the logistics of someone who had never been particularly interested in babies, but understood the practical requirements of the situation and executed them efficiently. Vivian watched this from the front of the room, conducting an arithmetic lesson for the middle students, while Eleanor was passed between capable hands in the back and thought about the phrase "it takes a village," which she had always considered vaguely sentimental before she had actually lived it, and understood that it was just a description of how things work when people decide to work together. The letter from the Territorial Marshal's office arrived in June, nearly 5 years after she had written her first complaint. She was in the ranch office when Tom brought it in from the weekly mail run, and she set down the ledger she was working on and opened it without ceremony, because she had learned not to approach official correspondence with anticipation in either direction. The letter was 3 pages. She read it twice. The individual known as Douglas Merritt had been identified, located, and arrested in Denver, Colorado, where he had been operating under a different name, and at least 2 additional correspondence frauds had been documented against him. The 5 Wyoming Territory complaints, including hers, had been submitted to the Denver authorities as supporting documentation. He had been tried in October of the previous year. The letter was dated 4 months ago and had taken that long to find her through the various address changes of the intervening years, and had been convicted on 4 counts of fraud and sentenced to 7 years. 7 years. She held that number in her mind for a moment. Not long enough, possibly. Long enough, possibly. She genuinely did not know how she felt about it, which she recognized as the honest answer and didn't try to improve on. She set the letter on the desk and looked at the window. The summer day outside was bright and specific. The yard, the barn. Cole coming out of the barn with his foreman discussing something. The distant line of the mountains. All of it so particular and solid, it almost seemed to push back against you. She thought about the woman who had written that first letter to the marshal's office, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with ink on her fingers, driven by the cold structural anger that had kept her functional through the worst months. She had written it not knowing if it would matter. She had done a lot of things not knowing if they would matter. Most of them had. Cole came in around noon and she handed him the letter without preamble. He read it standing, the way he read things he was going to have an opinion about, and when he finished he set it on the desk beside her. 5 years, he said. Nearly, she said. How do you feel? She looked at the letter. Like it's the right ending to a story I'm not really in anymore, she said. Like something that was unfinished is finished. But not, she searched for it, not relief exactly, more like closing a ledger. You note the final balance and you put it on the shelf. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. The other 4 women, he said. Do you know what happened to them? She had thought about this over the years. She knew 2 names, both from the marshal's original letter, and had, in a quiet way, wondered. No, she said. I don't know. You could find out, he said, if you wanted. She considered this. Maybe, she said. Someday. She picked up the letter and folded it and put it in the small wooden box she kept in the desk drawer, the box that held the other official correspondence from that chapter. The marshal's first reply, the ruling on the Consolidated Valley Holdings, the copy of her original complaint. She had not known, when she started the box, that it would become a document of how things resolved. She had started it just to keep things together. She closed the drawer. I should finish the Henderson accounts before supper, she said. Cole looked at her with that look, the one that had started as attentive and had become, over the years, something she could only describe as home. Not sentiment, just recognition. The look of a man who has known someone long enough to understand that their way of processing things is their way, and that the right response is often just to not interrupt it. "I'll start supper," he said. "You don't have to—" "I know," he said. "I want to." She let him. She turned back to the Henderson accounts, and the afternoon went on around her, ordinary and full, and the closed drawer stayed closed. Henry Garrett turned 21 that summer, a fact that Vivian registered with the specific disorientation of someone who remembers a person at 11 and cannot quite reconcile the two images. He had grown into a broad-shouldered, quiet young man who had his father's geographic face and, increasingly, his mother's considered way of speaking, the habit of thinking before answering that Vivian had watched develop gradually over the years she'd known him. As He came to the ranch in July with his father, ostensibly to discuss a cattle arrangement with Cole, but he found Vivian in the yard with Eleanor, who was learning to walk with the confident recklessness of someone who has not yet learned what falling costs, and he stopped and crouched down to Eleanor's level with the naturalness of someone comfortable around small children. "She's got your eyes," he told Vivian, standing back up. "She's got her own eyes," Vivian said. "She just hasn't decided what to do with them yet." Henry smiled. The smile had changed too, less defended than the 11-year-old version, more comfortable in his own face. "My father wants to talk to you about something," he said, "after he's done with Mr. Mercer." "What kind of something?" He looked at her with a directness she recognized as partly her own influence, the unadorned delivery of people who had learned that plain talk was more respectful than managed talk. "He wants to send my younger brother to the Hanover school. Caleb's 8. He's been—" Henry paused. "He's where I was. Same problem." "Same pride about it?" she said. "More, if anything." She looked at Eleanor, who had sat down unexpectedly and was examining this development with philosophical interest. "Send him," she said. "First week of September. And tell your father not to tell Caleb that you told me about the pride. Just bring him and let him figure out we're not going to make it about that." Henry nodded. "That's what I thought," he said. "I just wanted to hear it from you." He went inside and she picked up Eleanor, who had developed a decisive opinion about being on the ground and communicated it loudly, and stood with her daughter in the summer afternoon and felt the particular layered quality of this moment. Henry at 21, his brother at 8, the school 8 miles out, Carla Reyes in Garfield learning land law, the 43 families she could name off the top of her head who had passed through her professional life in 5 years. Eleanor put her hand flat against Vivian's cheek with the uncomplicated directness of children who have not yet learned that faces are private. "I see you," Vivian told her. Eleanor said something that was not yet a word and seemed perfectly satisfied with that. The fall brought the harvest, and the harvest brought the accounting season, which was when Vivian's workload peaked every year in the particular crunch of families bringing her their summer records to reconcile before winter. She had, by 1882, developed a system for managing this that involved Carla, who was back from Garfield with the specific sharpened look of someone who has been doing serious work and knows it, taking the simpler reconciliations, and Vivian handling the complex ones and the ones where the numbers told a story someone needed help understanding. It was not a perfect system. It was a system that worked, which is the most any system can honestly claim. The complicated situation that fall was Roy Garrett's. which was almost poetic given how far Roy had traveled from the man who had sat at her table 2 years ago being explained risk assessment. He came in September with 3 years of records and a specific problem. His second son wanted to buy into the ranch as a partner, which meant they needed to value the operation, which meant someone had to look at everything and tell them what it was worth and on what terms the partnership could be structured so that it didn't create problems 10 years from now. She spent 2 weeks on Roy Garrett's ranch valuation. It was the most complex single piece of work she had done, and she did it with the same attention she brought to everything. And when she presented the results to Roy and his son Daniel at the kitchen table of the Garrett Ranch, with Cole present as a witness at Roy's request, she walked them through every figure and every assumption and every place where she had made a judgment call and why. Daniel Garrett was 24 and had his father's face and considerably more formal education, having spent 2 years at a school in Laramie, and he asked sharp questions, the kind that were genuinely trying to understand rather than challenge. She answered all of them. When she was done, Roy Garrett sat back in his chair and looked at the valuation document for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Do you know what they said about you?" he said. "When you first came to Pine Hollow?" She had a reasonable idea. "I've heard some of it," she said. "They said Cole Mercer had taken pity on a woman who got swindled off a train," Roy said. "They said you'd be gone by winter." Cole beside her said nothing. He was looking at his coffee with the patient expression of a man who has heard this kind of thing before and knows his part is to stay quiet. "They weren't entirely wrong about what happened," Vivian said. "The swindle was real." "No," Roy said. "They were wrong about what it made you." He tapped the valuation document. "This is the best financial work anyone in this valley has ever seen. I know because I've had 2 other people try to value this ranch, and they couldn't do what you just did." He paused. "I should have asked you first." "You asked me when you were ready," she said. "That's fine." "Daniel," Roy said, not looking at his son. "I know," Daniel said. "I know, Dad." "Thank her properly." Daniel looked at Vivian with the expression of someone who has just watched something he will carry with him for a long time. "Thank you," he said. "I mean it." She gathered her papers. "Get the partnership agreement in writing," she said. "Both of you. Before anything else. It's not because you don't trust each other. It's because in 10 years, when there are 3 more variables nobody anticipated, you'll want the agreement to do the arguing for you." Roy made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Where were you 30 years ago when I went into business with my brother?" "Ohio," she said, "and considerably younger." The reckoning with Vance Tully came in the fall of 1882, which was later than anyone had expected and more comprehensive than most people had hoped for. It had not been finished in 1879 when the Territorial Land Office invalidated the Consolidated Valley Holdings filings. That ruling had stopped the immediate harm, but had not addressed the larger operation. And Vivian had known, in the practical way she knew most things, that it wasn't finished. She had continued keeping records, not obsessively, not with vendetta as the organizing emotion, but with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. When families mentioned irregularities in their dealings with Tully's outfit, she noted them. When patterns emerged in those notes, she documented the patterns. By the fall of 1882, she had 4 years of documented patterns, and those patterns, combined with the original land document analysis and a new set of complaints filed by 2 families on the west side of the valley, were enough for Clive Sanderson to bring a formal civil case. She was called to testify before the Territorial Land Court in Garfield in October. She went with Cole and spent 2 days in a courtroom explaining to a judge her methodology for identifying fraudulent recording practices, walking through the documentary evidence she had assembled, answering the questions from Tully's lawyer with the patient precision of someone who has already accounted for every challenge to her analysis and knows where each one leads. Tully's lawyer was good. He attacked her qualifications, her methodology, her possible bias as someone with a personal history of fraud victimization. She answered all of it directly, without heat, acknowledging the legitimate questions and addressing the bad faith ones with the same level tone. At one point, the lawyer said, "You're not a lawyer, Mrs. Mercer. You have no formal legal training. On what basis do you claim the authority to interpret these documents?" She looked at him. "I don't interpret the documents," she said. "I document what the numbers in them say and don't say, and I document where the recording procedures deviate from the Territorial Land Office's own published requirements. The court interprets." I just show the court where to look." There was a silence in the room. The judge, a man named Thaddeus Colum, who had the face of someone who had heard a great deal of testimony in his career and had learned to identify the useful kind, wrote something in his notes. Tully's lawyer moved on. The ruling came in November. The Consolidated Valley Holdings transactions were declared fraudulent in their entirety. The land titles reverted to their original holders. Vance Tully was ordered to pay restitution to 7 families, totaling a figure that would take years to collect, but was on record, and faced a separate criminal inquiry in Laramie that Vivian had no direct part in, but followed with the interest of someone who had put considerable work into making it possible. She read the ruling at the kitchen table of the ranch house on a Tuesday morning, with Eleanor in the chair beside her making a mess of her breakfast, with the focused creativity of a 9-month-old who has discovered that oatmeal has properties worth investigating. Cole came in from the morning rounds and poured coffee, and she handed him the ruling and he read it standing. "It's done," he said. "The restitution will take years," she said. "I know, but it's done." She looked at the ruling and then at Eleanor, who had achieved something with the oatmeal that required cleanup but was extremely pleased with herself. "Agnes Pratt's land is clear," she said. "That's the part that matters most." "All 7 families," Cole said. "All 7, she agreed. She took the ruling and put it in the wooden box in the desk drawer, next to the letter about Douglas Merritt's conviction and the copy of her original complaint to the marshal's office. The complaint she had written 4 years ago with ink on her fingers at Ruth's kitchen table. The box was getting full. She would need a larger box. She thought briefly about the woman who had put the first document in that box. Angry and broke and newly arrived in a place she hadn't chosen, doing the only thing she knew how to do, which was to be precise about what had happened so there was a record of it. She had not known then that precision would turn out to be the thing, the actual instrument of consequence, more than any amount of feeling or hoping or even courage. Just the discipline of writing down what was true in a way that couldn't be argued with. She put the box back in the drawer and turned to address Eleanor's oatmeal situation. Well, Ruth came to stay for Christmas that year, taking her own room at the ranch in the matter-of-fact way of someone who had been the original home and understood this one to be an extension of it. She was 61 and had slowed slightly at the edges. Nothing dramatic, just the gradual calibration of a woman who had been spending herself freely for decades and was starting to ration. She still ran the Aldrich house. She still managed her co-ownership of the supply store, though Harlan Eads did more of the heavy lifting now and had learned, after the invoice incident years ago, to give Ruth regular and accurate reports. She held Eleanor on Christmas evening and looked at the baby with the expression of someone calculating a thing that made her happy. "She looks like your mother," she told Vivian. Vivian looked at her. "You never met my mother." "No," Ruth said, "but she looks like she could have." She looked up with the gray eyes she shared with Cole. "You're the same age your mother was when she had you." 27, Vivian said. Yes. Vivian thought about this, about her mother in Columbus, who had been a practical woman in the particular way of women who don't have the luxury of being impractical, who had managed a household on very little, and had taught Vivian figures at the kitchen table with a patience that Vivian had not fully understood until she was doing the same thing at the Hanover School. Her mother had died at 44, and Vivian had thought sometimes, in the years since, about what her mother might have done differently if the world she'd lived in had offered more than it did. She would have liked it here, Vivian said, if it had been possible. Ruth looked at her steadily. "You made it possible," she said, "for other people." Vivian didn't say anything to that. It was the kind of statement that you could either accept simply or spend energy deflecting, and she was past the age of deflecting things that were just true. Cole came in from the kitchen where he had been doing something with supper that involved considerably more noise than was strictly necessary, and looked at Ruth and Vivian sitting by the fire with Eleanor. "Supper's in 20 minutes, he said. "We know," Ruth said. "We heard." "I was being efficient," he said. "You were being loud," Ruth said. "There's a difference." Cole sat down in the chair across from them with the specific patience of a man who has 2 women in his life with opinions and has made his peace with it. Eleanor reached toward him immediately, and he took her with the ease he had developed over 9 months, holding her against his shoulder while she grabbed at his shirt buttons with the single-minded focus she brought to all physical challenges. "She's going to pull those off," Ruth observed. "She's been trying for a week," Cole said. She'll get there eventually. You should sew them tighter. I probably should, he agreed, and made no move to do anything about it. The years that followed did not arrive in dramatic chapters. They arrived the way most of life arrives when you have stopped waiting for rescue and started running your own operation. Consecutively, demanding, full of small crises that required actual solutions, and occasional moments so quietly good that you had to remind yourself to register them before they passed. Caleb Garrett, Roy's youngest, turned out to have the same arithmetic problem Henry had once had, the same shame about it, the same reflexive hostility. And Vivian addressed it with the same method she had used on Henry, which was to find what he could already do and build from there. He progressed faster than Henry had, either because Vivian was better at it by then, or because having an older brother who had already done it removed some of the shame. Probably both. He came to tell her when he passed his examination. He was 12 and still had the slightly uncoordinated quality of a boy who has grown faster than he expected. And he stood at the schoolhouse door and said, "I passed the test, Mrs. Mercer." And she said, "I know, Mrs. Fenton told me." And he said, "Oh." And then stood there for a moment and then said, "Thank you," and left at speed, which was the Garrett family tradition, and which she found she would miss if it ever stopped. The guide she had written went through 3 additional printings. The last one in 1884, organized and paid for by the Pine Hollow Merchants Association, which was a thing that had not existed when she arrived and which had organized itself gradually and somewhat chaotically around the combination of the financial guide and the quarterly meetings she had been running since 1880 for the families she worked with. She had not intended to start a merchants association. She had intended to start a quarterly meeting. The association was what happened when the quarterly meeting kept growing. The Hanover School had 23 students by 1884 and 2 teachers, Carla Reyes, who had come back from Garfield to take a formal teaching position, and a young man named Philip Dern, who had arrived from the East looking for work and had been assessed by Vivian in a 30-minute conversation and found to be exactly the kind of steady, clear-headed person who was useful in a classroom. He had been hired on a Tuesday and started the following Monday, which was the pace at which things happened in the Pine Hollow Valley by then, because Vivian had spent 7 years making the infrastructure that allowed them to happen that fast. She was 35. This fact struck her sometimes with a quality of mild disorientation, not because 35 felt old, but because the distance between 27 and 35 had contained so much that it felt longer than 8 years, and simultaneously shorter because she had been fully occupied the entire time. The letter she had told herself she might write someday, the one to the other 4 women from the Marshal's original complaint, she finally wrote in the spring of 1884, after spending 6 months thinking about whether it was hers to write and concluding that the question would never answer itself if she kept waiting for it to. She found 2 of the 4 through the Marshal's office, which had the original complaint records. The other 2 she could not locate. Of the 2 she reached, one wrote back within a month, a woman named Clara Beach, who was living in Cheyenne and had built a dressmaking business, and wrote with the same compressed, careful energy Vivian recognized from her own early letters. The other did not write back, and Vivian accepted this without reading anything into it, because some things were private, and the choice about what to do with them belonged to the person they had happened to. Clara Beach's letter was 3 pages. It described 7 years of its own, different from Vivian's in every specific and recognizable in the shape of it. Clara had gone back east initially, then returned. She had not, she wrote, managed the recovery as cleanly as she would have liked. There were 2 years in the middle that she was not proud of. She had arrived at something like stability at the far end of it. Vivian wrote back and did not say I understand because she did not know exactly what Clara's 2 middle years had been, and claiming understanding she didn't have was its own kind of condescension. She said what was true, that she had also not managed everything cleanly, that some of the anger had taken years to work through, and that the Consolidated Valley Holdings case had gotten its resolution in part because she had put her original complaint on record, which meant Clara's complaint had too. Clara wrote back a 3rd time, then a 4th. They had been corresponding for 2 years by the time Vivian considered it, and what they had built across those letters was something she didn't have a clean category for. Not friendship exactly, in the sense of people who share daily life, but something with its own weight. The shared language of people who have been through the same particular thing and have both come out the other side carrying it differently. Eleanor was 3 when she developed the habit of following Vivian into the office and sitting under the desk while her mother worked, which Cole thought was faintly concerning and Vivian found mostly useful, since Eleanor's running commentary on what she was experiencing under there, delivered in the confident, half-formed sentences of a 3-year-old, provided a kind of white noise that Vivian had discovered she could work through comfortably. One morning, Eleanor emerged from under the desk with a piece of paper she had found somewhere and presented it to Vivian with the gravity of someone delivering important correspondence. It was an old supply invoice, blank on one side. Eleanor had covered the blank side with the kind of marks that 3-year-olds make when they have been watching someone write for their entire lives. Not letters exactly, but shapes that wanted to be letters, ordered in rows, moving left to right. "What's this?" Vivian asked. "My accounts," Eleanor said with perfect seriousness. Vivian looked at the paper and felt something move through her that started as amusement and became something more complicated on its way through. Something about inheritance, about what gets passed without being explicitly given, about the particular way children absorb the texture of their parents' days. "Can I see them?" she said. Eleanor handed over the paper with the careful deliberateness of someone entrusting something important. Vivian looked at it with full attention, which was what it deserved. "These look good," she said. Eleanor nodded, as if this was the expected verdict, and went back under the desk. In the summer of 1885, Vivian stood on the porch of the ranch house in the evening and watched the valley go to its colors, and the thought came to her, not for the first time, but with a particular clarity it hadn't had before. She had never written to the placement agency to tell them what had happened after. She had written to dispute the fee. She had written to notify them of the marshal's inquiry. She had never written to tell them that the woman who arrived at Redstone Crossing with $4.60 had not, in the end, been broken by what they had failed to prevent. She thought about whether to write that letter. She thought about it for 3 evenings, which was how she thought about things that were close to the bone. Not constantly, but returning to them in quiet moments until the shape of the right answer became clear. She decided not to write it. Not out of ongoing anger, which had long since completed its work and been retired, but because the letter would be for her, and she no longer needed it. What had happened to her was something she had stopped defining herself against. It had shaped her. The anger had been structural. She had been right about that. It had held her together through the worst months, the way a form holds concrete until it sets. But the structure was her own now, not borrowed from what had gone wrong. The woman who had stepped off that train was real. She had existed. But she was also simply the earlier version of someone who had continued becoming, not a different person, not transformed in the dramatic way stories sometimes promised, just the same person with more of her own history behind her, more of what she was capable of having been demonstrated by circumstance and time. Cole came out and stood beside her, as he had on so many evenings, and looked at the same valley. "Eleanor drew more accounts today," she said. "I saw them on the kitchen table," he said. "She's running a deficit. She doesn't know that word yet." "She will," he said. "She would. She would learn the word and the concept and the methodology, and she would learn it without anyone hiding from her that it was useful, without anyone suggesting that it was not for people like her, without any of the 1,000 small restrictions that had shaped Vivian's own learning into something that had to find its way despite the system rather than through it. That was the thing, Vivian thought. That was the thing under all of it. The reason the school mattered, and the guide mattered, and the quarterly meetings mattered, and the hours she had spent at kitchen tables going through numbers with people who had been taught to be afraid of numbers. Not that she had done something heroic. Not that she had survived something extraordinary, but that she had understood, somewhere in the middle of the worst year of her life, that the most durable revenge against a world that had tried to take everything from her was to make the world slightly less likely to do it to someone else. She had not fixed this frontier. The frontier was still hard, still expensive in the currency of human cost, still indifferent to whether you made it or not. She had not made it soft. She had just made it slightly more possible, in the specific ways available to one person with her specific skills, for the people in her particular corner of it. That was enough. It was, in the plain arithmetic she had always been good at, more than enough. Cole put his arm around her, the familiar weight of it, the domestic permanence of a gesture that had long since passed through the conscious into the habitual. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked at the valley, the creek that had nearly dried, the school 8 miles out, The mountains that had been there before any of them and would be there after. The families whose accounts she knew by heart, whose children she had taught, whose land she had helped protect. Agnes Pratt's 160 acres, clear and held. Carla Reyes in the Hanover schoolhouse on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Henry Garrett at 24, managing his father's ranch with a precision nobody had anticipated when he was 11 and furious about long division. Nothing specific, she said. Everything. Cole looked at the valley too. Same thing, he said. She leaned into him, and the evening settled around them, and the mountains went dark the way they always did. Slowly at first, and then all at once, the light leaving the peaks and the stars taking its place. That enormous quantity of stars that she had never quite gotten used to, that she hoped she never would. There was something important in the not getting used to it, something worth keeping. Eleanor was in the house behind them, and the lamp was in the window, and the valley was full of lit windows. People she knew, people who knew her, a whole geography of mutual reliance built one small thing at a time over 8 years of showing up and doing what was needed and refusing, without drama or announcement, to be someone the frontier could break. She had not come here to become this. She had come here hoping to belong to one person and had ended up belonging to a whole place, and the place had become hers in the only way that counted, not because she had conquered it or been celebrated by it, but because she had made herself useful to it in ways that were too woven in to pull out anymore. The stars came out, one, and then many, and then all of them. She stood on the porch of her own house and watched them, and felt the weight of everything behind her and the open space of everything ahead, and was, in the plain and durable and unperforming way that she had learned was the only way anything real ever was, exactly where she was supposed to be.